In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. And the earth was formless and empty, darkness covering the face of the deep, and the Spirit of God hovering over the surface of the waters, like a bird over an unhatched egg, waiting for something to begin. Then God spoke, and what he spoke became real. Light tore itself free from the darkness. The waters above were separated from the waters below. Dry land rose from the deep, and on that land grass and trees and every green thing pushed upward toward a sun that had not yet been placed in the sky. It was a world being dreamed into existence by the only voice that existed to dream it, and every word that voice uttered carried the weight of permanence. On the first day, light. On the second, the sky. On the third, the seas drew back, and the earth appeared, heavy with vegetation. On the fourth, the sun and moon and stars were set in their courses, marking days and seasons and years, a clock wound once and never needing to be wound again. On the fifth, the waters churned with living things, great sea creatures and small darting fish, and every bird of the air lifted itself above the waves with wings still wet from creation. And on the sixth day, God reached into the dust and formed the animals of the field, cattle and creeping things and beasts of every kind, filling the world with motion and noise and hunger and breath. But the sixth day was not finished. Something else remained to be made, something unlike anything that had come before. God said, "Let us make man in our image, after our likeness, and let them have dominion over the fish of the sea, and over the birds of the air, and over the cattle, and over all the earth." And so he took the dust of the ground, common dirt, the same material the worms would one day crawl through, and from it shaped a man. He breathed into the man's nostrils, and what had been clay became flesh, and what had been silence became a heartbeat, and what had been nothing became a living soul. The man's name was Adam, which means from the earth, because that is precisely what he was, the ground itself, given permission to stand up and walk. God planted a garden in the east, in a place called Eden, and set Adam there to tend it. Eden was no ordinary stretch of land. 4 rivers ran through it. Among them the Pishon and the Gihon, the Tigris and the Euphrates, and every tree that was pleasant to the sight and good for food grew from its soil. It was the world as God intended it, a world where nothing rotted, nothing bled, nothing died. At its center stood 2 trees unlike any others. The first was the tree of life, whose fruit could sustain a man forever. The second was the tree of the knowledge of good and evil, and of this tree God gave Adam one command: "You may eat freely of every tree of the garden, but of the tree of the knowledge of good and evil you shall not eat, for in the day that you eat of it, you shall surely die." It was the simplest instruction ever given. One tree out of every tree in a garden that stretched as far as the eye could see. One prohibition in an entire world of permission. And Adam, standing beneath the canopy of paradise, with dirt still fresh on his skin and the breath of God still warm in his lungs, agreed. But Adam was alone, and God saw that this was not good. Not sinful, not broken, simply incomplete. Of all the creatures in the garden, not one was a suitable companion for the man. The animals came to Adam, and he named them all, every beast of the field and every bird of the air, an act of authority that also became an act of loneliness, because in naming them, he understood what each one was, and none of them was like him. And so God caused a deep sleep to fall over Adam, and while he slept, God took one of his ribs and from it fashioned a woman. When Adam woke and saw her, his first recorded words were not a prayer or a question, but something closer to poetry. "This is now bone of my bones and flesh of my flesh. She shall be called woman, because she was taken out of man." Her name would later become Eve, meaning life or living, because she would become the mother of all who lived. They were naked and unashamed. The text is specific about this detail, not because it is interested in their bodies, but because it is interested in their innocence. They had no knowledge of vulnerability, no concept of exposure, no fear. They walked in the garden in the cool of the day, and God walked with them, and the world was precisely what it was supposed to be. It did not last. Of all the creatures God had made, the serpent was the most cunning. The text does not explain where this cunning came from, or why one animal among all the others carried within it the capacity for deception. It simply tells us that the serpent approached Eve with a question that sounded innocent, but carried poison in every syllable. Did God really say, "You shall not eat of any tree of the garden"? It was a masterful distortion, not a lie exactly, but a twisting of the truth that made God's single prohibition sound like a sweeping cruelty. Eve corrected the serpent, explaining that they could eat from any tree except the one in the middle of the garden, and that touching it would bring death. But the serpent pressed further. "You will not surely die, for God knows that in the day you eat of it your eyes will be opened, and you will be like God, knowing good and evil." You will be like God. It was the oldest temptation and the most effective one. The promise that obedience was not devotion but servitude, that the boundary God had drawn was not for their protection but for His advantage. Eve looked at the tree. She saw that its fruit was good for food, pleasant to the eyes, and desirable for gaining wisdom. 3 observations, each one reasonable, each one true on its surface, and together they formed the architecture of the first human catastrophe. She took the fruit and ate. Then she gave some to Adam, who was with her, and he ate too. The silence that followed must have been staggering. Their eyes were opened, just as the serpent had promised, but what they saw was not divinity. They saw themselves, exposed, ashamed, suddenly aware of a vulnerability they had never known they possessed. They sewed fig leaves together to cover their nakedness, a pitiful remedy for a wound that went far deeper than skin. And when they heard the sound of God walking in the garden in the cool of the day, they did not run to meet Him, as they must have done 1,000 times before. They hid. God called out to Adam, and the question He asked was not the question of someone who did not know the answer, "Where are you?" It was the question of a father standing in the doorway of a child's room, knowing full well what has been broken, giving the child the chance to speak first. Adam confessed that he was afraid because he was naked. God asked who had told him he was naked, and then, "Have you eaten from the tree that I commanded you not to eat from?" Adam's response was the first act of blame in human history. "The woman you put here with me, she gave me some fruit from the tree, and I ate it." In a single sentence, he accused both his wife and his God. Eve, when confronted, pointed to the serpent. The serpent had no one left to blame. God's judgment fell on all 3. To the serpent, "Cursed are you above all livestock and all wild animals. You will crawl on your belly, and you will eat dust all the days of your life." And then a strange and enigmatic promise embedded in the curse, words that would echo through every generation that followed. "I will put enmity between you and the woman, and between your offspring and hers. He will crush your head, and you will strike his heel." To Eve, pain in childbirth, and a desire for her husband that would be tangled up with his authority over her, a relationship that had been pure partnership, now twisted into something more complicated and more painful. To Adam, the ground itself would be cursed because of him. Thorns and thistles would grow where only good things had grown before, and he would eat bread by the sweat of his face until he returned to the dust from which he had been taken. "For dust you are," God said, "and to dust you shall return." God made garments of skin for Adam and Eve and clothed them. It is a detail easy to pass over, but it carries a weight that the rest of the story will bear out. Skin means an animal died. Something bled so that their shame could be covered. It was the first death in a world that had known no death, the first blood spilled on ground that had never tasted it, and it was God himself who spilled it. Then he drove them out of Eden and placed cherubim at its eastern gate, with a flaming sword that turned every direction, guarding the way to the tree of life. The garden was not destroyed. It was simply closed, locked behind a door that no human hand could open. A paradise remembered, but unreachable, the first and most permanent exile. Outside the garden, the world was harder. Adam knew Eve, and she conceived and bore a son named Cain, saying, "I have acquired a man from the Lord." Then she bore his brother, Abel. 2 sons, the first children ever born, arriving into a world that was already broken. Abel became a keeper of sheep. Cain became a tiller of the ground. The text draws this distinction carefully, because what comes next will hinge upon it. In the course of time, both brothers brought offerings to God. Cain brought fruit of the ground, the work of his hands, the produce of the cursed soil. Abel brought the firstborn of his flock and their fat portions, the best of what he had, killed and offered with blood. God looked with favor on Abel and his offering, but on Cain and his offering he did not look with favor. The text does not say why. Centuries of commentary have tried to fill the silence, suggesting that Cain's offering lacked faith, or that it was not the firstfruits, or that his heart was wrong while Abel's was right. The text itself refuses to explain, and perhaps that refusal is the point. The gap between God's acceptance of one and rejection of the other is the first great mystery of the human story, and Cain could not bear it. His face fell. His anger burned. And God, seeing the rage building in the man, spoke to him directly, with a gentleness that makes what follows even more terrible. "Why are you angry? Why has your face fallen? If you do well, will you not be accepted? And if you do not do well, sin is crouching at your door. Its desire is for you, but you must rule over it." It is the first time the word sin appears in the text, and it is described not as an abstract concept, but as a living thing, a predator lying in wait at the threshold, hungry and patient. God told Cain he could master it. God told Cain there was still a choice. Cain chose. He spoke to his brother Abel, and when they were in the field, Cain rose up and killed him. The text does not describe the weapon or the method. It does not need to. What matters is that the first human being born into the world became the first human being to commit murder, and the victim was not a stranger or an enemy, but his own brother, the only brother he had, killed in a field under an open sky with no one watching but God. God came to Cain with the same kind of question he had asked Adam in the garden. "Where is Abel your brother?" And Cain, with the blood still drying on his hands, gave the most infamous answer in the history of human speech: "I do not know. Am I my brother's keeper?" It was a lie wrapped in a challenge, a denial followed by an accusation, as if the very idea that he should be responsible for another human life was an unreasonable demand. God's response was immediate. "What have you done? The voice of your brother's blood cries out to me from the ground." The earth itself had become a witness, the same earth that had received Abel's blood now testifying against the man who spilled it. Cain was cursed from the ground. When he worked the soil, it would no longer yield its strength for him. He would be a fugitive and a wanderer on the earth, a man without roots, without home, without rest. Cain cried out that his punishment was more than he could bear, that anyone who found him would kill him. And God, in an act of mercy that sits strangely alongside the severity of the judgment, placed a mark on Cain, a sign that anyone who killed him would suffer vengeance sevenfold. What the mark looked like, no one knows. What it meant was that even a murderer, even the first murderer, was not beyond the reach of God's complicated and painful mercy. Cain went out from the presence of the Lord and settled in the land of Nod, east of Eden. Nod means wandering, and it is less a place on a map than a condition of the soul. He built a city there, the first city, and named it after his son Enoch. The detail is worth pausing over. The first city in human history was built by a murderer in exile, a man running from God and running from the ground that had swallowed his brother's blood. Whatever cities would become, however grand and powerful and beautiful, their origin in this story is a fugitive's attempt to put walls between himself and his wandering. From Cain's line would come the builders and the makers, the men who shaped the raw world into something useful and something dangerous. His descendant, Jabal, became the father of those who dwell in tents and have livestock, the first nomadic herdsmen. Jabal's brother Jubal became the father of all who play the harp and flute, the first musicians, the first artists. And their half-brother Tubal-Cain became the forger of all instruments of bronze and iron, the first metal worker, the man who taught humanity to shape weapons and tools from the hard bones of the earth. Culture, art, music, technology, all of it emerging from the line of a man cursed to wander, a line brilliant and restless and entirely estranged from the God who had made them. But it was Lamech, the great-great-great-grandson of Cain, who would reveal just how deep the corruption had spread. Lamech took 2 wives, the first recorded instance of polygamy, breaking the pattern God had established with Adam and Eve. And then he boasted to his wives in a song that reads less like poetry and more like a threat. I have killed a man for wounding me, a young man for striking me. If Cain is avenged sevenfold, truly Lamech 77-fold. Where Cain had murdered in jealousy and hidden his crime, Lamech murdered in pride and sang about it. Where Cain had received God's mark of protection with trembling, Lamech invoked it with swagger, claiming for himself a vengeance that belonged only to God. The line of Cain was not merely drifting away from God, it was sprinting. But the story does not end with Cain's line, because Adam and Eve had another son. After Abel's murder, Eve bore a child she named Seth, saying, God has appointed for me another offspring instead of Abel, for Cain killed him. Seth means appointed or granted, and in his name is the quiet acknowledgement that God had not abandoned the family, that the line Abel was supposed to carry forward would continue through someone else. Seth would have a son named Enoch, and it is recorded that in the days of Enoch, men began to call upon the name of the Lord. Where Cain's line was building cities and forging weapons and composing boastful songs, Seth's line was learning to pray. The genealogy that follows Seth is one of the most deceptively simple passages in all of ancient literature. It reads like a list. So-and-so lived a certain number of years, fathered a son, lived many more years, had other sons and daughters, and died. The pattern repeats 10 times, from Adam to Noah, and the rhythm of it is hypnotic in its monotony. Adam lived 930 years. Seth lived 912 years. Enoch lived 905 years. Kenan lived 910 years. Mahalalel lived 895 years. Jared lived 962 years. On and on it goes, each name followed by an enormous span of years, each entry ending with the same 2 words, and he died. It is the drumbeat beneath the melody, the reminder that God's warning in the garden had come true. They did not die the day they ate the fruit, not in the way we might expect, but die they did, every last one of them. And the genealogy makes sure you hear it. And he died, and he died, and he died. But one name breaks the pattern, and it breaks it so sharply that you cannot miss it. Enoch, the son of Jared, the seventh generation from Adam. The text says Enoch walked with God, and then says it again, as if once were not enough to convey how extraordinary this was. Enoch walked with God, and he was not, for God took him. He did not die. In a list defined by death, in a genealogy where every entry ends with the tolling of that same grim bell, Enoch simply vanished. He was there, and then he was not, because God took him somewhere else. Where he went, the text does not say. How it happened, the text does not explain. Enoch walked so closely with God that one day the walk simply continued beyond the boundaries of the visible world, and he never came back. After Enoch came Methuselah, his son, who would live longer than any human being ever recorded, 969 years. The longest life in the longest genealogy, and when you calculate the years, a remarkable detail emerges. Methuselah died in the very year the flood came. Whether he perished in its waters or drew his last breath just before the rains began, his death and the catastrophe are perfectly synchronized, as if his extraordinary lifespan were a kind of countdown, a clock measuring out God's patience in the years of a single man. Methuselah's son was Lamech, not the Lamech of Cain's line, the boastful killer, but a different Lamech, a man of Seth's line who carried the same name but a very different spirit. When his son was born, this Lamech spoke words that were not a boast but a prophecy, or perhaps a prayer. This one will comfort us in the work and painful toil of our hands caused by the ground the Lord has cursed. He named the boy Noah, a name that sounds like the Hebrew word for rest or comfort. In a world grinding under the curse, in a civilization growing darker with each generation, a father looked at his newborn son and dared to believe that, through this child, something might change. By the time of Noah's birth, the world had been populated for many generations, and the two lines, Cain's and Seth's, which had begun as separate streams, had begun to merge in ways that would prove catastrophic. The text tells us that the sons of God saw the daughters of men and found them beautiful, and they took wives for themselves from any they chose. Who these sons of God were remains one of the most debated questions in the entire ancient narrative. Some say they were fallen angels, divine beings who crossed the boundary between heaven and earth to take human women. Others say they were the descendants of Seth, the godly line, who intermarried with the descendants of Cain, the ungodly line, corrupting the separation that had kept one stream faithful while the other ran wild. Still others say they were kings and rulers, men of power who called themselves divine and took whatever and whomever they wanted. The text does not settle the argument. It tells us only what happened next. The Nephilim were on the earth in those days, and also afterward, when the sons of God came in to the daughters of men and they bore children to them. These were the mighty men of old, the men of renown, the Nephilim. The name itself carries a shadow over it. It may come from a Hebrew root meaning to fall, the fallen ones, and whether they were the offspring of these strange unions or were already present when the unions occurred, their presence marks the world as a place where boundaries had dissolved, where the line between human and something else had blurred, where greatness and corruption had become indistinguishable from each other. They were mighty. They were famous. And the world they inhabited was spiraling toward annihilation. God looked down upon what he had made, and what he saw broke something even in him, if it is possible to speak of God breaking. The text says this with a directness that has stunned readers for thousands of years. The Lord saw that the wickedness of man was great in the earth, and that every intention of the thoughts of his heart was only evil continually. Every intention, only evil, continually. It is the most comprehensive indictment ever written, a verdict with no exceptions, no caveats, no mitigation. Not some intentions, not mostly evil, not frequently. Every thought, in every heart, all the time. The imagination of the human race had become a factory of corruption, producing nothing but violence and depravity, and the earth itself was polluted by what its inhabitants had become. And then the most devastating sentence in the early chapters of the story, the sentence that makes everything that follows both necessary and unbearable. And the Lord regretted that he had made man on the earth, and it grieved him to his heart. Regretted, grieved. These are not the words of a distant deity observing a failed experiment with clinical detachment. These are the words of a creator who loved what he had made and was watching it destroy itself, who had breathed life into clay and was now watching that clay use its borrowed breath to murder, to corrupt, to defile every good thing it had been given. The God who had looked at creation and called it good now looked at it and felt pain. The earth was corrupt before God, and the earth was filled with violence. All flesh had corrupted its way upon the earth. Not just humanity, but the animals too, or at least the world in its totality. The entire living system that God had spoken into being had gone wrong. The violence was not incidental. It was comprehensive. It was the defining characteristic of the age. The air everyone breathed, the water everyone drank. Fathers killed sons, brothers killed brothers. The strong devoured the weak, and no one intervened, because there was no one left who saw anything wrong with it. The world Cain had set in motion with a single act of murder had become a world where murder was the organizing principle of daily life. God said, "I will blot out man whom I have created from the face of the land, man and animals and creeping things and birds of the heavens, for I am sorry that I have made them." It was a sentence of death upon the world, spoken by the same voice that had called the world into existence. The same mouth that had said, "Let there be light," was now saying, "Let it end." And in that space between creation and destruction, between the garden and the flood, an entire civilization had risen and fallen, had invented music and metallurgy and cities and agriculture, had produced poets and killers, lovers and tyrants, and had ultimately chosen, with the full weight of its collective will, to turn its face from the only being who had ever loved it without condition. This was the world into which Noah was born. This was the civilization in which he raised his sons. This was the darkness against which he would be measured and, against all probability, found different. Noah was 500 years old when his sons were born, and by then he had already spent centuries watching the world come apart. 500 years is an almost incomprehensible span of time, long enough to see empires rise and crumble, long enough to watch the slow erosion of everything decent, long enough to forget what decency looked like if you were not paying very careful attention. But Noah was paying attention. He had always been paying attention, and what he saw around him, year after grinding year, was a world that had made violence into a religion and cruelty into a pastime, a world where the strong took whatever they wanted and called it their right, where the weak perished without protest, because protest itself had become a kind of quaint absurdity. And Noah, somehow, did not bend. The text describes him with 3 phrases, and each one lands with the force of a verdict. Noah was a righteous man. Noah was blameless in his generation. Noah walked with God. Taken separately, any one of these would be remarkable. Taken together, in the context of a world where every other human heart had surrendered to corruption, they constitute one of the most extraordinary character descriptions ever set down in words. Righteous. The Hebrew word is tzaddik, and it does not mean perfect. It does not mean sinless. It means that Noah stood in right relationship with God. that his dealings with others were just, that when faced with a choice between what was easy and what was right, he chose correctly, often enough for God to notice. In a civilization that had abandoned every moral boundary, Noah held to the ones that mattered. He did not steal, he did not murder. He did not participate in the violence that had become as common as breathing. This does not mean he was never tempted, never angry, never afraid. It means that when the temptation came, when the anger surged, when the fear whispered that conformity was safer than conviction, something inside Noah held its ground. Blameless in his generation. That last phrase, in his generation, is doing more work than it first appears. It is both a compliment and a qualification, a statement that Noah's goodness was measured against the backdrop of his time. Whether Noah would have been considered extraordinary in any age, or whether his virtue shone more brightly because it was surrounded by such unrelenting darkness, is a question the text leaves open. Some would later argue that Noah was only righteous by comparison, that a candle looks brilliant in a cave but unremarkable at noon. Others would counter that maintaining any flame at all in that particular cave, when every wind in the world was trying to blow it out, was the more impressive achievement. The text does not take sides. It simply tells you what Noah was and lets you weigh it for yourself. Noah walked with God. Only one other man in the entire genealogy received those same words: Enoch, Noah's great-grandfather, the man who walked with God so closely that he never tasted death. But where Enoch was taken out of the world, removed from the corruption before it reached its peak, Noah was left in it. His walk with God did not happen in a garden or a temple or on a mountaintop removed from the noise. It happened in the middle of a dying civilization, surrounded by neighbors who would have thought his piety absurd if they thought about it at all. To walk with God in Eden was one thing. To walk with God in the world that Eden had become was something else entirely. What did that walk look like in practice? The text does not give us scenes from Noah's daily life before the Great Commission. It does not show us what he ate, how he worked, what conversations he had with the men and women around him. But we can trace the shape of his existence from the silences. He was not a king. He was not a warrior. He was not one of the mighty men of renown who dominated the age. He was, by every indication, an ordinary man, living an ordinary life in extraordinary times, a farmer perhaps, a man who worked the soil with his hands and came home tired, and sat with his family and prayed to a God that most of the world had either forgotten or abandoned. His greatness was not the kind that draws crowds. It was the kind that survives them. And then there was his wife. She is never named. In all the pages that will follow, through the commission and the construction and the catastrophe and the covenant, the woman who stood beside Noah is identified only by her relationship to him, Noah's wife. She is the most anonymous, essential character in the entire story, the woman without whom none of it works, and the text gives her no name, no description, no dialogue, no inner life. She is present at every critical moment and invisible in every account. She boards the ark. She survives the flood. She steps onto the new earth, and we know nothing about her except that she was there. This silence is not accidental. The ancient world did not always record what we wish it had recorded, and the absence of her name is itself a kind of testimony, not to her unimportance, but to the conventions of the time and the priorities of the narrative. She was the wife of the only righteous man on earth, and that means she either shared his convictions or was willing to follow them, which amounts to the same thing when the convictions in question require you to abandon everything you know and climb into a wooden box while the world drowns. Whatever her name was, whatever her fears were, whatever arguments she may have had with her husband in the long years of preparation, she stayed. That is the only detail that matters, and it is the one detail the text is willing to confirm. Noah's 3 sons were born when he was 500 years old, and their names were Shem, Ham, and Japheth. They arrived late in Noah's life, even by the standards of an age when men lived for centuries, and they arrived into a world that their father already knew was doomed. Whether Noah understood the full scope of what was coming before his sons were born, or whether the knowledge came later, the text does not say. But it tells us that by the time God spoke to Noah directly, the 3 boys were grown, married, and living in their father's household. Shem, the eldest, whose name means simply name or renown, would carry the most significant blessing and become the ancestor through whom the promises of God would travel forward into history. Ham, the middle son, whose name may be connected to the word for hot or dark, would play a role in the story's aftermath that would haunt his descendants for generations. Japheth, the youngest, whose name means enlargement or expansion, would become the father of peoples who spread across the earth in numbers that dwarfed his brother's lines. But at this point in the story, they were simply 3 young men living under their father's roof, married to 3 women whose names, like their mother-in-law's, the record does not preserve. 8 people. That is the number the story gives us. 8 people out of a world teeming with human life, and these 8 were the sum total of what God considered worth saving. Consider the weight of that for a moment. Not a city, not a tribe, not even a dozen. 8. A man, his wife, their 3 sons, and 3 daughters-in-law. Enough to fit in a single room. The human remnant, the seed from which every person alive today would descend, could have gathered around a single table for dinner. God looked at the world he had made, a world he had populated with who knows how many thousands or millions of people, and found 8 worth preserving. The arithmetic is staggering in its severity. But before God spoke to Noah about what was to come, the text pauses to record a single sentence that changes everything. A sentence so small it could be missed, between the catalogs of corruption and the coming judgment. 6 words in English, 8 in Hebrew, and they are the hinge on which the entire human future swings. But Noah found grace in the eyes of the Lord. Grace. The Hebrew word is chen, and this is the first time it appears in the entire narrative. Not in Eden, not after the fall, not in the genealogies, not in the account of Enoch's extraordinary departure. Here, at the lowest point in human history, in the moment when God has resolved to unmake what he made, the word grace enters the vocabulary of the story for the first time, and it enters attached to one man's name. Noah did not earn his survival. He did not accumulate enough good deeds to purchase a ticket out of the catastrophe. He found grace, which is another way of saying grace found him. It was given, not achieved. It was favor, not payment. And it was specific, not general, aimed at one man and through him at the slender remnant of his household. A beam of light so narrow it barely illuminated the ground it touched, but wide enough to keep the human race from extinction. God looked at Noah, and instead of seeing what he saw when he looked at everyone else, he saw something that made him pause. Not perfection, not a man without flaws or fears or doubts, but a man who had refused to let the world reshape him in its image, a man who had kept his face turned toward God when every other face had turned away. And in that refusal, in that stubborn and lonely faithfulness, God found enough to build a future on. What happened next was the most private and the most consequential conversation in the history of the pre-flood world. God spoke to Noah. How he spoke, the text does not say. Whether it was an audible voice that shook the air, or a vision in the night, or a knowing that settled into Noah's bones with a certainty no external evidence could have provided, we are not told. What we are told is what God said. And what God said was the end of the world. The end of all flesh has come before me. For the earth is filled with violence through them. And behold, I will destroy them with the earth. It was not a warning in the conventional sense, not a threat intended to provoke repentance, not a conditional prophecy that could be averted by better behavior. It was a verdict that had already been rendered, a sentence that had already been passed. The world was going to end. Everything that breathed on the face of the ground was going to die. The cities, the farms, the forges, the music, the children playing in the streets, the old men sitting in their doorways, the young women drawing water from their wells. Every single one of them was going to perish, and nothing anyone did from this moment forward was going to change that. Try to imagine hearing those words. Try to imagine being the one person in the world selected to receive that information, standing in a field or kneeling in prayer or lying awake in the dark hours before dawn, and suddenly understanding that everything you have ever known, everything you have ever seen, every person whose name you have learned and whose face you can recall, all of it is scheduled for annihilation. The neighbors who mock you are going to drown. The merchants who cheat you are going to drown. The children you have watched grow up in the village down the road. The ones who have done nothing wrong because they are too young to have done anything at all, they are going to drown too. Every living thing. Every breathing creature. The cattle in the fields and the birds in the trees and the insects in the grass, all of it swallowed by a catastrophe so total that when it is finished, the earth will look the way it did before God called the dry land out of the deep. Noah heard this, and he did not argue. He did not plead for the world the way Abraham would later plead for Sodom, bargaining God down from 50 righteous men to 10. He did not weep or rage or ask why. Perhaps he had seen enough of what the world had become to understand that the verdict was just, even if the method was terrible. Perhaps the violence had touched his own family in ways the text does not record, leaving him with wounds that made God's decision comprehensible even as it was horrifying. Or perhaps he was simply too stunned to respond, standing in silence while the full implications of what he had just been told washed over him like a wave. But God was not finished speaking. The sentence of destruction was not the whole message. Embedded within the announcement of the end was the blueprint for a beginning, a thread of mercy woven into the fabric of judgment so tightly that you could not pull one out without unraveling the other. God was going to destroy the world, yes, but he was also going to save Noah. He was going to save his wife, his sons, their wives. He was going to save a remnant of every living creature, enough to start again, enough to repopulate a world washed clean of the blood that had soaked it. The mechanism of that salvation, the specific instructions, the dimensions and materials and logistics of the great vessel that would carry them through the catastrophe, those details were coming. But before God laid out the blueprint, before he gave Noah the specifications that would consume the next century of his life, he made sure Noah understood the shape of the story he was being invited into. It was a story of endings and beginnings, of death and survival, of judgment and grace held together in the same hand. The world was going to die so that the world could be born again, and Noah, the quiet man, the righteous man, the man who walked with God through a civilization that had forgotten God's name, was going to be the one who carried the future on his shoulders. He was 600 years old when the flood finally came, which means he received God's commission with enough time still ahead of him to accomplish the impossible task that was about to be laid at his feet. How much time exactly is a matter of some calculation, and later we will count those years and fill them with labor and loneliness and the slow, grinding work of obedience. But for now, the story asks us to sit with Noah in the moment of his calling, the moment when a man who had spent his entire life being faithful in small things was told that the reward for his faithfulness would be the largest and most terrifying assignment ever given to a human being. He could have said no. That possibility hovers over the narrative like a shadow, never acknowledged but always present. He could have heard God's voice and decided that the price of obedience was too high, that the labor was too great, that the loneliness was too deep. He could have looked at his aging body and his small family and the sheer absurdity of what was being asked of him and walked away. No one would have blamed him, because no one else could hear the voice, and the only witness to his calling was the God who issued it. But Noah did not say no. The text records his response with a simplicity that borders on the severe, a simplicity that will become the defining rhythm of his character throughout the entire ordeal. When God told Noah what was coming and what he was expected to do, Noah listened. And when God finished speaking, Noah began to obey. No speeches, no objections, no recorded prayers of doubt or anguish, just obedience, pure and immediate and total. The obedience of a man who had been walking with God long enough to know that when God speaks, the only sane response is to do what he says. That obedience was about to be tested in ways Noah could not yet imagine. The commission God was about to give him would consume his body, exhaust his resources, isolate him from his community, and require him to stake everything: his reputation, his wealth, his family's safety, his sanity, on the word of a God whose plans made no sense to anyone but himself. Noah was about to become the most ridiculed man on earth, the punchline of every joke in a civilization that had 100 years to laugh at him before the laughter stopped. But he did not know any of that yet. All he knew, standing in the presence of the God who had chosen him from among all the men who had ever lived, was that the world was ending, and he had been asked to help build what came next. It was enough. For a man who had spent 5 centuries learning to trust a voice the rest of the world could not hear, it was more than enough. God gave Noah a set of instructions, and they were not vague. They were not spiritual in the way we sometimes expect divine communications to be, all metaphor and mystery and open-ended symbolism. They were the instructions of a builder speaking to another builder, precise in their measurements, specific in their materials, practical in their design, as if the creator of the universe had sat down with a piece of parchment and drawn out plans for the most important construction project in the history of the world, which, in a sense, is exactly what he did. Make yourself an ark of gopher wood. Make rooms in the ark, and cover it inside and out with pitch. Gopher wood. The word appears here and nowhere else in the entirety of ancient Hebrew literature. No one knows with certainty what kind of wood it was. Some have guessed cypress, because cypress is durable and resistant to water, and because the Hebrew word gopher sounds faintly like the Greek word for cypress, kuparisos. Others have suggested it was a type of wood that no longer exists, a species swallowed by the very catastrophe the ark was built to survive. The ambiguity is fitting. The material God chose for the salvation of the world is a material we can no longer identify, a reminder that the story reaches back into a world so different from our own that even its trees are strangers to us. But if the wood remains a mystery, the pitch does not. The Hebrew word is kopher, and it means a covering, a sealant, a substance applied to the surface of something to make it watertight. It is also, not incidentally, the same root from which the Hebrew word for atonement is derived. To cover the ark with pitch was to atone it, to seal it against the waters of judgment, to make it impervious to the destruction that would consume everything beyond its walls. The connection may be coincidental. It may not be. In a narrative this carefully constructed, there are no throwaway words. Then came the dimensions. The length of the ark shall be 300 cubits, its width 50 cubits, and its height 30 cubits. A cubit is the distance from a man's elbow to the tip of his middle finger, roughly 18 inches, though some ancient measurements put it closer to 20 or 21. Using the standard cubit, the ark would have measured approximately 450 feet long, 75 feet wide, and 45 feet tall. Using a longer cubit, those numbers climb higher still. By any reckoning, it was an enormous vessel, larger than anything the ancient world had built or would build for thousands of years afterward. To put those numbers into perspective, the ark was roughly the length of 1.5 football fields. Its proportions, a ratio of 30 to 5 to 3 inches, length, width, and height, are remarkably close to the proportions used by modern shipbuilders for large cargo vessels designed to be stable in open water. It was not shaped like the rounded bathtub of children's illustrations, and it was not the narrow, elegant craft of a sailing ship. It was a barge, a floating warehouse, broad and flat-bottomed, and designed not for speed or maneuverability, but for one purpose only: to stay afloat. It did not need a rudder, because it had nowhere to go. It did not need sails, because there was no destination. It needed only to survive, to hold together while the world outside tore itself apart, and the proportions God specified were exactly the proportions required to do that. The interior design was equally deliberate. Make it with lower, second, and third decks, 3 levels stacked on top of each other inside the hull, creating a total interior space that modern calculations estimate at approximately 1.5 million cubic feet, roughly the cargo capacity of 450 standard railroad boxcars. That is an almost absurd amount of space, and it was all going to be needed because the ark was not just carrying a family, it was carrying the future of every species on Earth. God specified one window, set in the top of the ark, finished to a cubit above, likely a ventilation opening that ran around the perimeter of the roofline, allowing air to circulate throughout the vessel while keeping the rain out. And God specified one door, set in the side of the ark, one way in, one way out. The symbolism was as practical as it was theological. When the time came to enter, there would be no ambiguity about how to do it, and when the door was shut, it would be shut for everyone, inside and out. These were not suggestions. They were not guidelines to be adapted according to Noah's preferences or expertise. They were specifications from the mind of God, handed to a man who had no shipbuilding experience, no construction crew, no precedent to work from, and no visible reason to believe that a boat of any kind would ever be necessary. Noah lived in a world where, by many ancient traditions, it had never rained. The pre-flood world, some have argued, was sustained by a mist that rose from the ground and by subterranean water sources, a world where the sky had never opened and water had never fallen from above. Whether or not that was the case, the idea of a flood so vast that it would cover the mountains was, to anyone standing on dry land under a clear sky, the most preposterous thing a man could claim to be preparing for. And yet, the instructions kept coming. God told Noah to bring food for his family and for every animal, enough to sustain them for however long the ordeal would last. Think about that for a moment, not as a line in an ancient text, but as a practical problem. Noah did not know how long they would be inside the ark. He did not know what every animal ate, or how much, or how to store it. He was being asked to provision a floating zoo for an unknown duration with an unknown menu, and the penalty for getting it wrong was the extinction of entire species. The grain stores alone would have been staggering, to say nothing of the dried grasses, the fruits, the seeds, the insects that certain animals would require, the fresh water that would need to be collected and stored in quantities sufficient for hundreds, possibly thousands of living creatures. But before the first tree was felled, before the first plank was cut, before Noah drove the first peg into gopher wood, God made him a promise. And it is the promise, more than the dimensions, more than the materials, more than the engineering, that gives the entire enterprise its foundation. But I will establish my covenant with you, and you shall come into the ark, you, your sons, your wife, and your sons' wives with you. Covenant. The word appears here for the first time in the narrative. The first time God uses it with any human being, and he uses it not with a king or a priest or a prophet, but with a carpenter standing in a field. A covenant is not a contract. A contract is an agreement between equals, enforceable by law, breakable by either party. A covenant is something deeper and more binding, a promise made by the stronger party to the weaker, secured not by the weaker party's ability to hold up their end, but by the stronger party's commitment to hold up his. God was telling Noah that his survival was not contingent on the quality of his craftsmanship or the strength of his engineering. It was contingent on the word of God. The ark would hold because God said it would hold. The family would survive because God said they would survive. The covenant was the bedrock beneath the blueprint, the foundation upon which everything else rested. It was an extraordinary thing to say to a man who had not yet picked up a tool. Before a single board was nailed, before a single joint was sealed, before a single day of labor had been invested, God declared the outcome. You will come into the ark. You will survive. I am establishing my covenant with you. It was as if God, knowing the decades of doubt and exhaustion and ridicule that lay ahead, wanted to give Noah something to hold on to that was more durable than wood and more waterproof than pitch, his word. The project might take 100 years. The neighbors might laugh until their lungs gave out. The work might break Noah's back and his spirit and his confidence in his own sanity, but the covenant would hold. The promise would not fail. And when the waters rose, the ark would float, because the God who designed it was also the God who guaranteed it. And so Noah began to build. Picture the scene. An old man, centuries old by now, but still strong enough to fell a tree and shape a beam, standing in a clearing with his 3 sons beside him, looking at the open ground where the largest structure the world had ever seen was about to take shape. No cranes, no power tools, no team of hired laborers or conscripted workers, just a father and his sons, a set of divine measurements, and the raw material of the forest around them. The first tree would have come down with the sound of an axe, a sound that would echo through that clearing and across the surrounding countryside for years, for decades, a rhythmic percussion that became the heartbeat of Noah's life. The logistics of the construction are staggering, even to consider. 300 cubits of hull means hundreds, possibly thousands, of full-grown trees needed for timber alone. Each tree had to be felled, stripped, shaped, dried, and transported to the construction site. Gopher wood had to be identified, harvested, and worked, and if it was anything like cypress, it was a dense and heavy wood that resisted rot, but also resisted the saw and the chisel. The pitch had to be collected or manufactured, heated to the proper consistency, and applied to every interior and exterior surface in quantities sufficient to waterproof a vessel the size of a modern cargo ship. The joints had to be mortised and pegged with precision, because a single weak seam in a hull bearing the weight of thousands of animals and the pressure of an ocean's worth of water would mean catastrophic failure. And all of this had to be done without any of the infrastructure that large-scale construction requires. No roads to transport timber, no sawmills to process it, no forges large enough to produce the tools needed for a project of this scale, unless Noah built those too. Every nail, every peg, every brace and beam, and every plank was the product of manual labor, performed by a family of 8 in a world that thought they were insane. How long did it take? The text does not give a direct answer, but the arithmetic offers clues. Noah was given his commission sometime after his sons were born and married, which places it roughly in his 5th century of life. The flood came when he was 600 years old. That leaves a window of perhaps 100 years, possibly less, possibly more, depending on when precisely the commission was received and how quickly the sons married. 100 years. A century of waking up every morning and walking to a construction site to work on a boat that sat on dry land under a sky that had never produced a single drop of rain. Think about what 100 years of that kind of labor does to a man. The first decade might have been fueled by the urgency of the calling, the raw energy of obedience, and the momentum that comes from starting something enormous and watching the first beams take shape. But by the 20th year, the hull was still unfinished. By the 30th year, the neighbors had moved past curiosity and into contempt. By the 50th year, Noah's own body was aging, his muscles aching in the mornings, his joints protesting the daily climb up scaffolding that grew taller with each passing season. And by the 70th, 80th, 90th year, with the sky still clear and the ground still dry and the world still spinning on its axis as if nothing were wrong, the temptation to stop, to admit that perhaps he had misheard, perhaps the voice had been a dream or a delusion or the product of an old man's grief, must have been almost unbearable. But Noah did not stop. Day after day, year after year, decade after decade, the hammering continued. The text says it with the same severe economy it uses for everything Noah does. Thus Noah did. According to all that God commanded him, so he did. No fanfare, no drama, no interior monologue about the burden of the task. Just the flat statement that Noah did what God said, all of it exactly as it was prescribed, and kept doing it until it was finished. His sons would have grown into middle age during the construction. Shem, Ham, and Japheth spent their youth hauling timber and mixing pitch and learning the geometry of a vessel that none of them fully understood. They married women who must have known, from the first moment they joined this family, that they were marrying into something no one else in the world believed in. These young wives left whatever families they came from, whatever communities they belonged to, and bound their futures to a man who spent his days building a boat in a desert, and his evenings explaining to anyone who would listen that God was going to destroy the earth with water. To marry into Noah's household was to accept permanent exile from the normal world, to become an object of pity at best and ridicule at worst, and to do it on nothing more than the testimony of a father-in-law who claimed to hear the voice of God. And what of the world around them? The text tells us that life continued as usual right up until the moment the flood came. Centuries later, the words of a teacher would describe those final days with a specificity that is almost cruel in its ordinariness. They were eating and drinking, marrying and giving in marriage, right up until the day Noah entered the ark. They knew nothing about what was coming until the flood came and took them all away, eating, drinking, getting married, planning weddings and hosting feasts and negotiating dowries and arguing about property boundaries, doing all the things that people do when they believe tomorrow will look exactly like today, that the world they know is the world that will always be. Noah was among them. He was not hidden on a mountaintop or sealed away in a cave. He was in the middle of the community, visible, accessible, and manifestly building something that demanded explanation. A structure 450 feet long and 45 feet tall does not go unnoticed, particularly in an age before industrial construction, when the largest man-made objects were modest by comparison. The ark would have been visible from miles away, a colossal wooden skeleton rising against the skyline, and everyone who saw it would have wanted to know what it was and why it was being built. Later writings would call Noah a preacher of righteousness, a man who did not merely build in silence, but spoke to the people around him about why he was building. He told them. He warned them. He explained that the God they had abandoned had not abandoned his authority over them, that the violence and corruption they had accepted as normal were offenses against the God who made them, and that a reckoning was coming that would make every previous disaster look like a rainstorm. And they laughed. Of course they laughed. What else could they do with a man who claimed the sky was going to open and drown the world? He had no evidence, no precedent, no argument that could compete with the daily testimony of their own eyes. The sun rose, the crops grew, the rivers flowed within their banks. Nothing in the observable world supported Noah's claims, and everything in the observable world contradicted them. The mockery would not have been gentle. In a civilization defined by violence, the treatment of a man perceived as a fool or a lunatic would have been harsh. Noah would have endured insults, threats, possibly physical abuse. His sons would have been taunted by their peers. His daughters-in-law would have been pitied or mocked by the women they had grown up with. The entire family bore the weight of a conviction that no one else shared, and they bore it not for a week or a month, but for the better part of a century. That is a long time to be the only people in the world who believe the world is ending. And yet the work went on. Plank by plank, beam by beam, deck by deck, the ark took shape. The lower deck was framed and floored. The second deck rose above it. The third deck crowned the structure, just below the roofline where the window would allow light and air to enter. The rooms God had specified were built within, stalls and pens and chambers and storage areas, a labyrinth of compartments designed to house creatures of every size, from the largest beasts to the smallest creeping things. The pitch was applied, layer upon layer, coating every surface until the wood gleamed black and oily, sealed against the water that was coming. Noah would have learned skills he never planned to learn: carpentry, engineering, the practical physics of weight distribution and structural integrity, how to join two massive beams so that the joint would not crack under lateral pressure, how to brace a hull so that it flexed without breaking, how to calculate the slope of a deck so that water drained rather than pooled. None of this knowledge came from experience, because no one had ever built a vessel of this kind before. It came from the instructions God had given him, and from the painful, incremental process of trial and error that accompanies any project attempted for the first time. His sons would have developed their own expertise. One might have become skilled at felling and shaping timber. Another might have taken charge of the pitch, learning through years of practice exactly how to heat it, how to apply it, how to identify and seal the tiny gaps that would be invisible to the eye, but fatal to the vessel's integrity. The third might have managed the logistics of food storage, calculating how much grain and dried fruit and preserved meat would be needed, building the containers to hold it, devising systems to keep it dry and free from rot. It was a family enterprise in the truest sense, every member contributing, every member essential, every member sustained by nothing more than their father's unshakable conviction that what they were doing was not madness, but obedience. There would have been moments of doubt. The text does not record them, but the text does not need to, because doubt is not the opposite of faith. It is the shadow faith casts in the presence of overwhelming evidence to the contrary. On the mornings when the sky was perfectly clear, and the birds sang and the world looked exactly as it always had, Noah must have felt the pull of uncertainty. On the evenings when his body ached and his hands were raw, and the ark seemed no closer to completion than it had a year ago, the question must have whispered itself into his mind: what if I am wrong? What if this is all a mistake? What if the voice I heard was not God but something else, something inside me that broke under the weight of living in a broken world? But faith, the kind of faith that builds arks, is not the absence of doubt. It is the decision to keep building despite the doubt. It is the hammer that swings on the morning after the worst night. It is the peg that is driven on the day when nothing in the world makes sense except the sound of the work. Noah's faith was not a feeling. It was an action, repeated 10,000 times over 100 years, until the action itself became the proof of the faith that motivated it. Somewhere in those long decades, the ark was finished. The last plank was fitted. The last coat of pitch was applied. The last storage room was filled with provisions. The great vessel sat on the dry ground, its hull towering over the landscape like a monument to either the greatest act of faith or the greatest act of folly the world had ever seen. From the outside, it looked like a coffin. From the inside, it looked like a womb. Both impressions were correct. Noah stood before it. A man older than any man alive today could imagine being, his hands scarred by a century of labor, his reputation destroyed by a century of preaching no one believed, his family bound together by a bond that went deeper than blood, because it had been forged in shared ridicule and shared purpose. The ark was ready. The provisions were stored. The rooms were built and sealed and waiting. Everything God had commanded, Noah had done. Now the only thing left was for God to fill it. God spoke again. After the decades of silence that had filled the years of construction, after the long quiet in which the only divine communication Noah received was the memory of the original instructions and the discipline to carry them out, God broke through a second time, and what he said changed the tempo of everything. The pace of the story, which had stretched across a century of slow and grinding labor, suddenly contracted to a single week. 7 days. That is all the time that remained between the world as it was and the world as it would never be again. Come into the ark, you and all your household, for I have seen that you are righteous before me in this generation. The word God used was not go, it was come. The distinction matters more than it might first appear. Go into the ark would have been a command given from a distance, a general dispatching his troops to a position he himself did not occupy. Come into the ark was an invitation from someone already there, as if God were standing inside the vessel he had designed, holding the door open, beckoning Noah and his family to join him in the one place on earth that would survive what was coming. It was the language of a host, not a commander. The language of someone who intended to be present in the ark with them, not watching from above while they endured the catastrophe alone. And then God laid out the final details of the cargo. Of every clean animal you shall take with you 7 pairs, the male and his female, and of the animals that are not clean, 2 of each, the male and his female. Also of the birds of the heavens, 7 pairs, male and female, to keep their offspring alive on the face of all the earth. The numbers require attention. 2 of every kind had been the general instruction given during the original commission, enough to preserve the species, enough to allow reproduction after the waters receded. But now God added a layer of specificity that revealed something about the world that would exist on the other side of the flood. Clean animals, 7 pairs. Unclean animals, 1 pair. The distinction between clean and unclean would not be formally codified in written law for many centuries, not until Moses stood on another mountain and received another set of instructions from the same God. But Noah already understood the categories. He knew which animals were suitable for sacrifice and which were not, which could be offered on an altar and which could not, which were set apart and which were common. This was not new information. It was ancient knowledge, passed down through the generations of Seth's line, preserved in the practices of men who still remembered how to worship even as the world around them forgot. The reason for the larger number of clean animals was both practical and theological. Some of them would be sacrificed after the flood, offered on an altar as an act of worship and thanksgiving, and if Noah had brought only 2 of each clean species, a single sacrifice would have meant extinction. 7 pairs gave him enough to sacrifice and still preserve the breeding population. It was the mathematics of worship built into the logistics of survival, a reminder that the ark was not merely a lifeboat. It was a vessel carrying the raw materials of a world in which God intended to be worshipped again. But here is the question that has pressed itself against the imagination of every person who has ever heard this story. How did the animals come? The text is remarkably specific on this point, and what it says overturns every assumption about Noah spending weeks or months rounding up creatures from the far corners of the earth. God told Noah that the animals would come to him. 2 of every sort shall come to you, to keep them alive. They would come, not be hunted, not be captured, not be lured with food or driven with whips or trapped in cages and hauled across continents. They would come under their own power, guided by an instinct that was not instinct at all but the hand of the God who had made them. The same God who had once brought the animals to Adam in the garden so he could name them. What God had done at the beginning of the story, he was doing again at its turning point, gathering the creatures he had made and presenting them to the man he had chosen, not for naming this time, but for saving. Picture it. From every direction, from forests and plains and mountains and marshes, they began to move. Pairs of animals, walking, crawling, slithering, flying, all of them converging on a single point in the landscape where a wooden vessel sat on dry ground like a monument to absurdity. Lions walking beside deer, wolves padding alongside sheep, serpents gliding through grass that would soon be underwater, following a compulsion they could not have understood, drawn by a force that overrode every natural impulse of predation and fear and territorial aggression. For a brief and extraordinary moment, the enmity that had defined the animal kingdom since the curse in the garden was suspended, and the creatures of the earth moved together in a peace they had not known since Eden. The sight of it must have been staggering to anyone who witnessed it. The people in the surrounding communities, the same people who had spent decades laughing at Noah and his impossible boat, would have looked up from their meals and their markets and their quarrels to see a procession unlike anything the world had ever produced. Animals in pairs, marching as if following a road that only they could see, converging on the ark from every direction. Some would have been familiar: cattle and sheep and goats, the domesticated creatures that lived alongside humans. But others would have been strangers, beasts from distant lands that no one in the region had ever seen before, creatures that had no business being there but were there nonetheless, walking calmly toward a destination they had never visited, obeying a summons they had never heard spoken aloud. What did the watching world make of this? The text does not tell us. Perhaps some were frightened. Perhaps some were merely curious. Perhaps a few, seeing the animals stream toward the ark in numbers that grew with each passing hour, felt the first cold touch of doubt, the first whisper that maybe the old man had been right all along, that maybe the sky was not as permanent as it seemed. But if any of them felt that doubt, none of them acted on it. None of them joined the procession. None of them approached Noah and asked if there was room for one more. The animals came, and the people stayed where they were, separated by a distance that had nothing to do with geography and everything to do with belief. Noah would have stood at the entrance, watching them arrive. After 100 years of building, after a century of preparing rooms and stalls and pens and feed troughs, the purpose of all that labor was finally becoming visible. The creatures filed in, each finding its place in the vessel's interior, guided by the same unseen hand that had brought them to the ark in the first place. The larger animals would have been directed to the lower deck, where the hull was strongest and the center of gravity lowest, their weight helping to stabilize the vessel in the waters that were coming. The smaller creatures, the birds and the rodents and the insects, would have occupied the upper levels, closer to the window where the air was freshest. The arrangement was not random. It was the work of a mind that understood both biology and engineering, a mind that had designed the animals and the ark and had planned from the beginning for one to fit inside the other. How many animals entered? The text speaks of kinds, not species, and the distinction is significant. A kind, in the ancient understanding, was a broader category than the modern biological species, closer to what we might call a genus or a family. Noah did not need 2 of every breed of dog. He needed 2 of the dog kind. He did not need 2 of every variety of horse. He needed 2 of the horse kind. The diversity we see in the animal kingdom today, the hundreds of dog breeds, the dozens of horse varieties, the countless subspecies of birds and reptiles and insects, could all have descended from a much smaller number of original kinds, diversifying over the generations that followed the flood through the natural processes of adaptation and variation. By this reckoning, the number of individual animals aboard the ark, while still enormous, was not the impossibility that a strict species-by-species count would suggest. Even so, the logistics were formidable. Thousands of creatures, each with different dietary needs, different temperaments, different tolerances for confinement and darkness and proximity to other animals. Predators separated from prey. Nocturnal animals sheltered from daylight. Creatures that required warmth kept away from creatures that required cold. The storage rooms that had been filled with provisions over the preceding years now had to be organized and managed so that the right food reached the right animals at the right time, a task that would fall to 8 people, working without rest for as long as the ordeal lasted. But all of that was a problem for the days ahead. For now, the animals were arriving, and Noah's task was simply to receive them. Day after day during that final week, the procession continued. The birds arrived in flocks, settling on the ark's upper structures, their wings folding as they found their roosts. The cattle came in their heavy, plodding way, their hooves leaving deep prints in the soil as they climbed the ramp and disappeared into the dark interior. The reptiles came low to the ground, silent and purposeful. The insects came in clouds, spiraling through the air before funneling into the vessel like smoke drawn through a chimney. Each creature, regardless of size or temperament, moved with a calm that was entirely unnatural, a peace imposed upon them by the same authority that had summoned them. 7 days. God had given Noah 7 days between the command to enter and the beginning of the catastrophe. 7 days to load thousands of animals, to settle them into their quarters, to make the final checks on provisions and water supplies, and to check structural integrity. 7 days to say goodbye to the world outside, to walk the familiar paths one last time, to look at the sky and the trees and the fields, and know that all of it was about to be swallowed. 7 days to grieve for what was coming, even as he prepared to survive it. The number 7 is not incidental. It carries the weight of the creation week, the original 7 days in which God made the world and rested. Now, in a grim and deliberate echo, God was giving 7 days before he unmade it. The symmetry is precise and painful. What had taken a week to build was being given a week's warning before its destruction. Creation and uncreation, framed by the same number, governed by the same God, separated by the full span of human history from Adam to Noah, the whole catastrophic arc of it compressed into a single, terrible rhyme. During those 7 days, Noah's family entered the ark. The text records their boarding with the same spare efficiency it uses for everything else in Noah's story, listing them without commentary: Noah and his wife, his 3 sons, and their 3 wives. They walked through the door in the side of the ark, the one door God had specified in the original design, and they stepped out of the world they had always known, and into a floating darkness that smelled of pitch and straw and animal fear. Whatever they carried with them, whatever personal possessions or keepsakes or small comforts they brought aboard, the text does not mention. It mentions only that they entered, and in entering they left behind everything else. Try to imagine what those final steps felt like. Noah's wife, whoever she was, crossing the threshold for the last time, knowing that when she emerged, the landscape outside would bear no resemblance to the one she was leaving. The daughters-in-law, young women who had married into this family knowing it was different from every other family on earth, now discovering just how different. The sons, who had spent their youth building this vessel, and their early manhood filling it, now walking into the structure their own hands had raised, feeling the planks beneath their feet that they had cut and fitted, smelling the pitch they had boiled and applied, and understanding for the first time that this was not a construction project any longer. It was a lifeboat, and the ocean it was meant to survive had not yet arrived. Outside, the world was unchanged. The sun still rose and set. The marketplaces still bustled. The forges still rang with the sound of hammers on metal. People ate their meals and drank their wine and quarreled with their neighbors and planned for a future that had exactly 7 days left in it. None of them knew. The text is emphatic on this point. They knew nothing until the flood came. Not nothing in the sense that they had not been warned, because Noah had warned them for a century. Nothing in the sense that they did not believe. The warning and the disbelief had existed side by side for 100 years, and in the end, the disbelief won, as it always does when the evidence of the senses contradicts the testimony of a single voice. Did anyone come to the ark during those final 7 days? Did anyone, seeing the animals arrive in their impossible procession, seeing Noah and his family carrying their last provisions up the ramp, seeing the careful, deliberate preparations of a man who clearly believed the end was imminent, did anyone hesitate? Did anyone linger at the edge of the clearing, watching the spectacle with something more than amusement, something closer to dread? The text does not record a single visitor, a single convert, a single person who looked at the evidence assembling before their eyes and decided that perhaps the old man had been right. If such a person existed, they did not act on their doubt in time. The door was open for 7 days, and not one soul from outside Noah's family walked through it. And then the 7 days ended. The last animal had entered. The last provision had been stored. The last of Noah's family had crossed from the outside to the inside, from the world of the living to the vessel of the saved. The ramp was clear. The entrance stood open, a rectangle of light in the side of the great dark hull, the only breach in an otherwise sealed structure. And then God shut the door. The text says it plainly. And the Lord shut him in. Not Noah, not his sons. Not a mechanical device or a system of ropes and pulleys. God himself closed the door of the ark. It is one of the most quietly staggering sentences in the entire narrative. A sentence that reveals something about the nature of what was happening that no human action could have conveyed. When God shut the door, he was not merely sealing a vessel against water. He was drawing a line between two realities, the world that was ending and the world that would begin, and he was doing it with his own hand. Noah could have shut the door himself. He had built it. He knew how it was fitted, how it was sealed, how the pitch had been applied to its edges to make it watertight. Closing it would have been a simple mechanical act, a matter of pulling the heavy wooden slab into its frame and securing it with whatever bolts or braces he had designed. But God did not let him. God reached down, if it is possible to speak of God reaching, and closed the door himself, and in doing so took the act of judgment out of Noah's hands entirely. This matters more than it might seem. If Noah had shut the door, he would have been the one deciding who was in and who was out. He would have been the one sealing the fate of every person on the other side of that wall, every neighbor, every acquaintance, every person who had laughed at him, or threatened him, or simply ignored him over the preceding century. The weight of that would have been unbearable. To pull a door shut knowing that everyone outside it is going to die is an act of condemnation that no human being should have to perform, and so God performed it instead. The judgment was God's. The salvation was God's. The door was God's to open and God's to close, and Noah's only role was to be inside when it happened. The sound of that door closing must have been the loneliest sound Noah had ever heard. It was the sound of finality, of a decision that could not be reversed, of a boundary that could not be crossed again from either direction. Inside the ark, in the sudden and total darkness that would have followed the closing of the only entrance, 8 people and thousands of animals stood in silence, breathing the heavy air, listening to the creak of the wood and the rustle of straw and the soft, restless movements of creatures that did not yet understand why they were confined. Outside the ark, the world continued. People went about their business. The sun may have been shining. The birds that had not entered the ark may have been singing. Everything looked normal. Everything felt normal. And everything was about to end. How long did the silence last? The text does not say whether the rains began immediately after the door was shut, or whether there was a pause, an interval of stillness between the sealing of the ark and the opening of the sky. But the narrative rhythm suggests a pause, a held breath, a moment of suspension in which the world hung between what it had been and what it was about to become. Inside the ark, Noah and his family waited in the dark, hearing nothing but the sound of their own breathing and the muffled stirring of the animals around them. They could not see the sky. They could not see the ground. They could not see each other's faces. They had entered a world of wood and pitch and darkness, sealed inside by the hand of God, and all they could do now was trust that the same hand would carry them through whatever came next. Outside, the people who had rejected every warning, who had laughed at every sermon, who had watched the animals arrive and still refused to believe, went back to their lives. They ate their suppers. They put their children to bed. They locked their doors against the violence of the night, the same violence they had always known, the same violence they assumed would be the worst thing the world could throw at them. They had no idea that the violence of men was about to be dwarfed by the violence of God, that the locked doors they trusted would be as useless against the coming water as a child's hands held up against the tide. The world was quiet. The ark was sealed. The animals were still. 8 souls sat in the dark, wrapped in the smell of gopher wood and the weight of a silence so complete it felt like the world was already holding its breath, gathering itself for something enormous. Something that had been building since the first drop of Abel's blood touched the cursed ground, and the earth opened its mouth to receive it. Somewhere above them, beyond the sealed window and the pitched roof and the 3 decks of carefully built chambers, the sky was beginning to change. On the 17th day of the 2nd month, in the 600th year of Noah's life, the world ended. The text records the date with the precision of a coroner, noting the time of death, because that is exactly what it was. An entire planet, with all its cities and fields and forests and mountains, with all its sleeping children and waking farmers and men who had laughed at a madman for 100 years, died on a specific day, and the ancient record wants you to know which day it was. It began from below. On that day all the fountains of the great deep burst forth. Not opened, not leaked, not gradually rose, burst. The Hebrew word carries the violence of something ripping, something that had been held under unimaginable pressure and was suddenly, catastrophically released. The fountains of the great deep were the subterranean reservoirs that lay beneath the crust of the earth, vast stores of water that had been sealed below the surface since the 2nd day of creation. When God separated the waters above from the waters below, they had been there all along, silent and invisible, held in place by the same word that had put them there, and now that word released them. Imagine the ground splitting open. Not in one place, but in hundreds, in thousands. the entire surface of the earth fracturing like the shell of an egg struck from the inside. Columns of superheated water and steam would have erupted from the cracks with a force that dwarfed any volcanic eruption the modern world has ever witnessed, shooting miles into the atmosphere, carrying with them rock and sediment and the pulverized remains of whatever had been standing above the fault lines. The noise alone would have been beyond comprehension, a roar so deep and so sustained that it would have been felt in the bones before it was heard in the ears, a sound like the planet screaming. The earth itself was tearing apart. The foundations upon which everything had been built, the bedrock that men had trusted to hold their cities and their roads and their fields and their graves, was splitting open and vomiting water in volumes that no human measurement could capture. Rivers reversed their courses. Lakes disappeared into newly opened chasms. The ocean floors cracked and heaved, sending tsunamis racing across the surface at speeds that would have crossed continents in hours. The pre-flood world, whatever its geography had been, was being dismantled from the inside out, its own foundations used as the instrument of its destruction. And then the sky joined in, and the windows of heaven were opened. The language mirrors the language of creation. On the second day, God had placed an expanse between the waters above and the waters below, a barrier that held the atmosphere in place and kept the celestial waters from falling. Now that barrier was breached. The windows of heaven, a phrase that suggests not ordinary rain but the removal of a structural boundary, were thrown open, and what had been held back since the formation of the world came pouring down. This was not rain, as anyone alive today has experienced rain. This was not a storm, not a deluge in the ordinary sense, not even the most violent monsoon multiplied 1,000 times. This was the sky collapsing. The waters that had been suspended above the firmament since the second day of creation were released in their entirety, and they fell with a weight and a volume that turned the air itself into a wall of water. To stand outside in the first minutes of that downpour would have been like standing beneath a waterfall that stretched from horizon to horizon, an unbroken curtain of water so thick that breathing would have been impossible, that seeing more than a few inches ahead would have been impossible, that remaining upright would have been impossible. The rain did not fall in drops. It fell in sheets, in slabs, in a continuous and merciless torrent that did not pause for a single moment during the 40 days and 40 nights that followed. 40 days and 40 nights. The number would echo through the rest of the story's larger narrative, recurring at critical moments in the lives of those who came after Noah. The 40 days Moses would spend on the mountain receiving the law. The 40 years Israel would wander in the wilderness. The 40 days a teacher from Nazareth would spend in the desert, being tested. But here, at its first appearance, the number 40 marks a duration of sustained destruction so total that the world on the other side of it bore no resemblance to the world that had existed before. 40 days of rain falling without interruption, without lessening, without mercy. 40 nights of darkness so complete that the stars themselves were hidden behind the weight of the water falling from the sky. And beneath the rain, the fountains of the deep continued to pour, the two sources of destruction feeding each other, the water from above meeting the water from below, until the distinction between sky and sea became meaningless. The waters rose. The text tracks their progress with a terrible patience. First, the low places filled, the valleys, the riverbeds, the plains where the cities of men were densest, where the markets and the temples and the houses stood in rows. The water would have entered the streets slowly at first, ankle-deep, then knee-deep, then waist-deep, rising with a steadiness that was almost gentle in its cruelty, giving people just enough time to understand what was happening before it took them. Families would have climbed to the roofs of their homes, then to the tops of the tallest buildings, then to the hills above the cities, each elevation buying them a few more hours, a few more minutes, a few more desperate breaths before the water found them again. The strong would have fought for the highest ground. Men would have killed each other for a place on a ridge or a boulder or a treetop. The same violence that had defined their civilization now turned to the single purpose of survival, and failing at even that. Women would have held their children above the water, arms shaking with exhaustion, until the water rose above their mouths and they could hold them no longer. Old men, who had lived for centuries, who had seen the world change and change again, who had perhaps even remembered the warnings of a man named Noah and dismissed them as the ravings of a fanatic, would have watched the water climb toward them and understood, in the final minutes of lives that had lasted longer than any life would ever last again, that the fanatic had been right. And the animals, the cattle in the fields would have lowed in terror as the water swallowed the pastures. The wild beasts would have fled uphill, their ancient rivalries forgotten in the shared panic of drowning, lions running beside antelope, wolves scrambling alongside the very sheep they would have hunted the day before. The birds would have taken to the sky, but there was no sky, only water falling from above in quantities that dragged them back to earth, their wings too heavy to lift, their bodies beaten down by a rain that had more in common with a river than a storm. The serpents would have swum for a time, their bodies designed for water, but even they could not swim forever, and one by one they too would have slipped beneath the surface and been still. And the waters prevailed exceedingly on the earth, and all the high hills under the whole heaven were covered. The mountains, which had seemed so permanent, so unconquerable, the last refuge of the desperate, the places where the strongest and the fastest and the most determined had fled in the hope that altitude would save them. The mountains, too, were swallowed. The water rose 15 cubits above the highest peaks, a margin of depth that the text notes with the same clinical precision it brings to every measurement in the story. 15 cubits, roughly 22 feet, enough to ensure that the ark, with its draft of several cubits, could float over the summits without scraping bottom. The water did not merely reach the mountain tops, it buried them. The world was gone, not damaged, not disrupted, not temporarily inconvenienced, gone. Every hill, every valley, every forest, every field, every road, every bridge, every wall, every monument that human hands had raised during the long centuries between Eden and this moment, all of it lay beneath an ocean that had no shore. The world that the descendants of Cain had built, with their cities and their forges and their music and their weapons, the world that the descendants of Seth had tried to redeem with their prayers and their faithfulness, all of it was underwater. The accumulated achievements of the entire human race, everything they had learned and made and dreamed and fought for, were buried beneath a depth of water so vast that a man standing on the deck of the ark would have seen nothing in any direction but an unbroken horizon of gray extending to every edge of the compass, meeting the gray sky at a line so indistinct that the water and the clouds seemed to be the same substance. And all flesh died that moved on the earth. Birds, livestock, beasts, every creeping thing that creeps on the earth, and every man, all in whose nostrils was the breath of life, all that was on the dry land, died. The repetition is deliberate. The text says it once, and then says it again, as if the first statement were not comprehensive enough, as if the reader might find some loophole, some category of living thing that had been overlooked. Everything died. The birds died. The cattle died. The beasts died. The creeping things died. The men and women and children died. Everything that breathed, everything that walked or crawled or flew or ran, everything that had drawn air into its lungs on that last morning when the sky was still clear and the ground was still dry, was dead. The text hammers the point home with a bluntness that is almost savage in its refusal to soften the reality of what happened. This was not a local flood. This was not a regional disaster. This was the extermination of terrestrial life on a planetary scale, and the text wants you to feel the full weight of it. He blotted out every living thing that was on the face of the ground, man and animals and creeping things and birds of the heavens. They were blotted out from the earth. The word blotted carries the connotation of erasing, of wiping clean, of taking something that was written and making it as if it had never been there at all. God did not merely kill the inhabitants of the earth, He erased them. He removed them so completely that when the waters eventually receded, there would be no cities to find, no roads to follow, and no landmarks to recognize. The pre-flood world was not just destroyed, it was unmade, returned to a state so close to the formless void that had existed before creation that the parallel could not be missed by anyone paying attention. Inside the ark, Noah and his family could hear it. They could not see it, sealed as they were behind walls of pitched gopher wood, but they could hear the rain hammering the roof with a violence that never diminished, could feel the vessel shudder as the waters rose beneath the hull, could sense the moment when the great weight of the ark lifted free of the ground and began to float, rocking on the surface of a sea that had not existed an hour before. That moment, the moment the ark left the earth, must have been the most terrifying and the most vindicating of Noah's life. Terrifying, because the solid ground that had supported the vessel for a century of construction was no longer there, replaced by a churning abyss that had swallowed everything he had ever known. Vindicating because the boat floated, the design held, the pitch did not fail, the joints did not crack. The hull that he and his sons had built with their own hands over the course of 100 years did exactly what God had said it would do. But vindication, if Noah felt it at all, would have been swallowed almost immediately by the sound of what was happening outside, because beyond the walls of the ark, people were dying, not abstractions, not statistics, not the faceless masses of a distant population. These were people Noah had lived among for centuries, people he had warned, people he had preached to, people whose faces he knew, whose voices he recognized, whose children he had watched grow up. And they were dying, all of them, in water that had no bottom and rain that had no end, and there was nothing he could do about it because God had shut the door and the door was not going to open. What do you do when you are sealed inside the only safe place on earth and everyone outside is dying? What do you feel? Relief, perhaps, that you and your family are alive. Horror at the scale of the death. Guilt, the specific and irrational guilt of the survivor who cannot explain why they were spared when others were not. Grief for the world itself, for the beauty of the forests and the rivers and the mountains that were being swallowed, for the animals that did not make it aboard, for the songs that would never be sung again, and the stories that would never be told. And beneath all of it, the terrible knowledge that this was just, that the God who sent the water had seen the violence, had counted the cruelties, had weighed the corruption and found it absolute, and that the drowning world was reaping what it had sown. Justice and mercy, destruction and salvation, occupying the same moment, the same storm, the same God. The rain fell for 40 days and 40 nights without stopping. The fountains of the deep continued to pour, and the waters prevailed upon the earth for 150 days. That second number is easy to miss, buried as it is in a sentence that reads like a summary. But 150 days is 5 months. 5 months, during which the entire surface of the earth remained submerged, during which no dry land existed anywhere on the planet, during which the only solid object above the waterline was a wooden vessel carrying 8 people and the remnant of every terrestrial species, drifting on an ocean that covered the world from pole to pole. 5 months of water. 5 months of gray sky meeting gray sea at every point of the compass. 5 months of floating on the grave of everything. The world beneath the waves was silent now. The screaming had stopped long ago. The struggling had ceased. The last desperate swimmer had gone under, and the water had closed over them without a ripple. The great cities were tombs. The mountains were reefs in an ocean too deep to fathom. The forests were tangles of dead wood, swaying in the current like the hair of the drowned. Everything that had been alive was dead, and everything that had been dry was deep. And the only sound in the world was the sound of the rain on the roof of the ark and the water lapping against its hull. Noah's family floated on this silence, carried by a vessel they had built with their own hands, sealed inside by the hand of a God who was simultaneously destroying and preserving, ending and beginning, killing and saving. The contradiction was the point. It had always been the point. The flood was not merely a punishment. It was a baptism, the submersion of a world too sick to heal, held under until the sickness was gone, until the violence had drowned and the corruption had dissolved, and the earth was clean enough to start again. But starting again required surviving. And surviving, as Noah and his family were about to discover, was its own kind of ordeal, longer and quieter, and in some ways more difficult than the catastrophe itself, because the rain would eventually stop and the waters would eventually begin to fall, but the waiting, the long and maddening and faith-testing waiting for the world to reappear was only just beginning. The days inside the ark had no horizon. They had no sunrise, no sunset, no visible sky against which to measure the passage of time. They had only the dim light that filtered through the window near the roofline, a slit of gray that would have been nearly indistinguishable from the darkness on the worst days, when the rain was heaviest and the clouds pressed down like a lid on the world. Noah and his family lived in a perpetual twilight, moving through the labyrinth of stalls and storage rooms by memory and by feel, their footsteps echoing on wooden planks that were never quite dry, their voices swallowed by the low ceilings and the ambient noise of thousands of restless creatures. The daily work would have been relentless. 8 people, responsible for the feeding, watering, and maintenance of every living species on Earth. The sheer logistics of the operation beggar belief. Each morning, and the word morning is generous in a world without visible dawn, the family would have risen from whatever cramped quarters they occupied and begun the rounds. The large herbivores on the lower deck needed enormous quantities of hay, dried grasses, and grain, stores that had to be carried from the food chambers and distributed to individual stalls. The smaller herbivores, the rodents and the rabbits and the countless small mammals, needed seeds and dried fruits and roots. The birds required grain and insects, and, for the raptors, strips of dried meat. The reptiles, slower in their metabolism and less demanding in their appetites, still needed to be fed and checked and kept at temperatures that would not kill them in the damp chill of the vessel's interior. Water was its own crisis. Fresh water for drinking had to be collected, stored, and distributed to animals whose daily consumption ranged from a few drops to several gallons. The irony was brutal. Surrounded by more water than the earth had ever seen, every drop of it undrinkable, salty from the oceans it had merged with, contaminated by the sediment and the death it carried. Whatever freshwater reserves Noah had stored before the flood, they had to last. Rainwater could be collected through the window, and this would have helped. But filtering and distributing it to thousands of animals spread across 3 decks was a task that alone could have consumed the full working day of every person aboard. And then there was the waste. Thousands of animals produce thousands of pounds of waste every day, and in an enclosed vessel with limited ventilation, the accumulation would have been staggering. The straw in the stalls had to be changed, or at least turned and supplemented. The waste had to be collected and disposed of, likely shoveled out through the window or through channels built into the lower deck that drained into the water below. The stench would have been extraordinary, a thick, warm, living smell that permeated every surface and every garment and every lungful of air. After the first week, no one aboard would have noticed it. After the first month, it would have become as invisible as the darkness, but it was there, constant and inescapable, the smell of survival at its most unglamorous. The family would have divided the labor. Shem and his wife might have taken the upper deck, managing the birds and the smaller mammals. Ham and his wife might have handled the lower deck, where the largest and most demanding animals were housed. Japheth and his wife might have managed the middle level, or taken charge of the food stores, monitoring supplies and rationing carefully against a duration they could not predict. Noah and his wife would have overseen the whole operation, troubleshooting problems, mediating the inevitable tensions that arise when 8 people live in a confined space under extraordinary stress, and making decisions that affected not just their family but the future of every species on the planet. Sleep would have come in shifts, if it came at all. The animals did not rest on a convenient schedule. Nocturnal creatures stirred when the diurnal ones slept. Newborns, if any were born during the voyage, needed constant attention. Sick animals had to be identified and treated before whatever ailed them could spread through a population that had no room to quarantine. The work was not heroic. It was not the stuff of legends or songs. It was the grinding, unglamorous, exhausting labor of a family functioning as zookeepers, farmers, veterinarians, and janitors, all at once, all the time, with no days off and no relief, and no promise that the work would ever end. And then there was the motion. The Ark was not a sailing ship with a keel designed to cut through waves and a rudder to hold a course. It was a barge, flat-bottomed and broad-beamed, and on a sea with no shore and no floor, it would have rocked and pitched and rolled in ways that would test even a modern sailor's constitution. The long, slow swells of a global ocean would have tilted the vessel from side to side in a rhythm that never quite became predictable, each roll slightly different from the last, each pitch arriving at an angle that kept the body from ever fully adjusting. Seasickness would have been unavoidable, at least in the early weeks, and for some of the family, it may have persisted for much longer. Imagine being sick to your stomach while shoveling animal waste in the dark. Imagine it going on for months. The psychological toll would have been worse than the physical one. Confinement does things to the human mind that open air and sunlight can heal, but that darkness and enclosure amplify without limit. The family was trapped in a floating box with no view, no space, no privacy, no escape from each other or from the animals or from the unrelenting sameness of every single day. The first month might have been bearable, sustained by the adrenaline of survival and the novelty of the experience. The second month would have been harder. By the third and fourth months, with no end in sight and no communication from the God who had sent them here, the silence would have become its own kind of torment. Because God was silent. After the commission, after the instructions, after the command to enter and the closing of the door, God said nothing. The narrative records no visions, no reassurances, no whispered encouragements in the dark hours when faith was thinnest. Noah had been given a covenant, a promise that he and his family would survive, and that promise was all he had. No updates, no progress reports, no timeline, just the sound of rain and water and animals and the creak of wood under stress, day after day after day, and the silence of a God who was apparently content to let his servant float in the dark without a word. This silence is one of the most important features of Noah's story, and it is almost always overlooked. We speak of Noah's faith in building the ark, and rightly so, because a century of construction on nothing but God's Word is an extraordinary act of trust. But the faith required to endure the silence inside the ark was, in many ways, more demanding. Building the ark was active. It involved movement, progress, the satisfaction of watching a structure take shape. Floating in the ark was passive. It involved waiting, enduring, sitting still while the world outside was a void and the God above was mute. Active faith is difficult. Passive faith, the faith that does nothing because there is nothing to do, the faith that simply waits in the dark and trusts that the darkness is temporary, is almost impossible. Noah waited. He waited through the 40 days of rain. He waited through the weeks that followed, when the rain finally stopped but the water did not recede. He waited through the flat, featureless months when the ark drifted on an ocean that offered no landmarks, no signs of land, no indication that the world beneath the waves was anything other than a permanent grave. He waited while his family grew restless, while the animals grew agitated, while the supplies grew thinner and the air grew staler and the hope grew harder to hold. And then, in the middle of all that waiting, the text delivers one of the most powerful sentences in the entire account. A sentence so simple that its force can only be felt if you understand the emptiness that preceded it. But God remembered Noah. Remembered. The word does not mean that God had forgotten. It is not the language of an absent-minded deity who suddenly recalled that he had left a family floating in a box somewhere. In the ancient vocabulary, to remember is to act, to turn attention towards someone with the intention of doing something on their behalf. When God remembered Noah, he was not retrieving a misplaced thought. He was initiating a rescue. He was turning his face toward the ark with the same deliberateness with which he had turned his face away from the world that the ark was floating on. The silence was not abandonment. It was the pause before the next act, the held breath between the end of destruction and the beginning of restoration. God remembered Noah and all the beasts and all the livestock that were with him in the ark. The animals are mentioned specifically, and this is not a courtesy. God did not merely remember the man. He remembered the cargo, the living freight that the man had been entrusted with, every pair of wings and hooves and claws and scales that the ark contained. The animals mattered. They had always mattered. They were not incidental passengers on a human journey. They were the reason for the vessel's enormous size, the purpose behind its 3 decks and its thousands of compartments. And God remembered them alongside the man who had fed and watered and cleaned up after them for the better part of a year. And God made a wind blow over the earth, and the waters subsided. Wind. It is not an accident that the Hebrew word for wind, ruach, is the same word used for the Spirit of God that hovered over the waters at the very beginning of the story, before the first day of creation, before light, before land, before life. The wind that blew over the flood was an echo of the Spirit that had brooded over the original chaos, and it served the same purpose, to bring order out of disorder, to push back the waters, to prepare the way for dry land to appear. Creation was happening again, not from nothing this time, but from the wreckage of what had been, from the sediment and the silt and the bones of the old world. A new surface was being prepared. The fountains of the deep were closed. The windows of heaven were shut. The rain was restrained. Each of these actions is described with the same deliberate language that had been used to describe their opening, because the stopping of the flood was as intentional as its beginning. God did not simply allow the waters to drain on their own. He actively closed the sources, sealed them, restrained them, and put them back behind the barriers that had held them since creation. The destruction had been controlled from start to finish, and so was the recovery. The waters receded steadily from the earth, and at the end of 150 days, the waters had decreased. The timeline is precise. 5 months after the flood began, the waters started to fall. Not quickly, not dramatically, steadily, which is another word for slowly, which is another word for maddeningly. The water that had risen in a matter of weeks, swallowing mountains and continents in a furious assault, now retreated at a pace that would have been nearly imperceptible from inside the ark. A few inches a day, perhaps? A foot? Enough to lower the surface of the global ocean by an amount that would have been invisible to anyone looking out the window, because the horizon would have looked exactly the same as it had the day before, and the day before that, and the day before that. But the ark could feel it. The vessel, which had been floating freely on the surface of a bottomless ocean, began to respond to the shallowing of the water beneath it. The currents changed. The swells became shorter, choppier, more irregular, as the water column beneath the hull decreased, and the waves began to interact with whatever was rising toward them from below. And then, on the 17th day of the 7th month, exactly 5 months after the flood had begun, the ark came to rest. It did not crash. It did not run aground in the violent, splintering way that a ship strikes a reef. The text says it rested, using a word that carries the connotation of settling, of coming to rest gently, of finding a stable position after a long period of motion. The keel touched something solid, and the rocking stopped, and for the first time in 5 months, the floor beneath Noah's feet was not moving. After 150 days of constant, nauseating, relentless drift, the ark was still. It came to rest on the mountains of Ararat, not on a single peak, on the mountains plural, a range in what is now eastern Turkey near the borders of Armenia and Iran. The highest peak in the range rises over 16,000 feet, and even if the ark rested on a lower summit or a high ridge, the altitude was considerable. The waters were still deep enough to cover most of the Earth's surface, but this one range, or rather the upper reaches of this one range, had finally breached the surface, providing a foundation for the vessel that had been looking for one since the 17th day of the 2nd month. The ark had been afloat for exactly 5 months. It had been built on dry land. It would end its voyage on a mountaintop. Between those 2 moments of stillness, the entire world had been destroyed, and the slow work of rebuilding it had begun. But Noah could not yet see any of this. The ark had settled, but the water was still everywhere. The window near the roofline gave him a view of the sky, but the terrain surrounding the vessel, the slopes and ridges of the mountains on which the ark now sat, remained submerged. He knew the ark had stopped moving. He could feel the solidity beneath his feet for the first time in months, but he could not see land. Not yet. The waiting was not over. 2.5 more months passed. The text marks the time with a patience that mirrors Noah's own. The waters continued to recede, and on the first day of the 10th month, the tops of the mountains became visible. Not Ararat alone, but other mountains, other peaks, breaking the surface of the receding water like islands emerging from a vast and featureless sea. After months of gray horizon, after months of seeing nothing in any direction but water and sky, Noah could finally see something solid, something fixed, something that was not moving with the current or changing with the waves, rock, earth. The bones of the world, showing through the skin of the flood, for the first time since the 17th day of the 2nd month. He waited 40 more days. 40 days of looking at those mountaintops, watching the water drop inch by inch, feeling the ground around the ark slowly emerge, wet and scarred and littered with the wreckage of the old world, but solid, undeniably solid and undeniably real. 40 days of restraint, of refusing to act until the time was right, of sitting still when every instinct screamed to open the door and step outside. Noah had learned patience in the century of construction. He had learned it again during the months of floating. And now he was learning it a third time, in the agonizing interval between knowing the flood was ending and being free to leave. After those 40 days, Noah opened the window of the ark and sent out a raven. The raven is a fascinating choice, though the text does not explain why Noah selected it. Ravens are scavengers, hardy birds with strong wings, and an ability to survive on almost anything, carrion included. A raven could fly for hours without tiring. A raven could eat whatever it found floating on the surface, the remains of the dead, the debris of the drowned world, and sustain itself indefinitely. A raven did not need dry land to survive. It needed only something to eat, and the surface of a post-flood world would have offered plenty. The raven went out, and it went to and fro until the waters were dried up from the earth. It did not return to the ark. It did not come back with any information. It simply flew back and forth, circling the area, landing on whatever floating debris or exposed rock it could find, feeding on whatever it found there, and refusing to come back inside. The raven told Noah nothing useful. It did not confirm that the land was habitable. It did not bring back evidence of vegetation or fertile soil. It simply left and kept leaving, and Noah was no wiser for having sent it. And so he sent a dove. The dove was the opposite of the raven in almost every way that mattered. Where the raven was a scavenger, the dove was delicate. Where the raven could feed on death, the dove needed seeds and grain, the products of living plants growing in dry soil. Where the raven could land on carrion and wreckage and floating debris, the dove needed a clean, dry place to rest, a branch, a ledge, a piece of solid ground that was not submerged or fouled. The dove was not a test of whether the water was receding. The raven had already confirmed that. The dove was a test of whether the earth was ready for life. She found nowhere to set her foot and returned to him in the ark, for the water was still on the face of the whole earth. The detail that follows is one of the most tender moments in the entire narrative, and it is easy to miss in the larger sweep of the story. He put out his hand and took her and brought her into the ark with him. Noah reached out his hand. He did not wait for the dove to find her own way back through the window. He did not call to her from inside. He extended his hand into the open air, the first time in months that his skin had felt wind and weather, and he gently took the exhausted bird and brought her back inside. It is a gesture of such small and specific kindness that it tells you more about Noah's character than a dozen verses about his righteousness. This was a man who, after everything he had endured, after months of darkness and labor and silence and grief, still had the gentleness to reach out his hand for a tired bird. He waited 7 more days and sent the dove out again. This time, she came back in the evening, and in her beak was a freshly plucked olive leaf. Freshly plucked, not dried, not dead. Not a relic of the old world carried on the current. A living leaf, torn from a living branch, growing on a living tree, somewhere out there on the newly exposed surface of the earth. The olive tree is one of the hardiest plants in the Mediterranean world, capable of surviving flood and drought and soil that would kill almost anything else, and it would have been among the first to push new growth through the mud and the sediment of the receding waters. That single leaf, small enough to fit in a dove's beak, was the first evidence of life returning to a dead world. It was proof that the earth was not merely draining. It was growing. It was recovering. It was alive. Noah knew then that the waters had receded from the earth. He knew it not because he could see it from the window, not because God had told him, but because a dove had brought him a leaf. The creator of the universe, who could have spoken directly to Noah or sent an angel or written the message in the sky, chose instead to deliver the most important news in the history of the post-flood world through the beak of a small and tired bird. The method was as significant as the message. The world was not being restored by spectacle. It was being restored quietly, incrementally, one leaf at a time, and the man who had been chosen to inherit it was learning about its recovery the same way. He waited 7 more days and sent the dove out a 3rd time. She did not return. The earth had become habitable enough for a dove to find food and shelter and a place to nest, and she had chosen the open world over the confines of the ark. Her absence was the answer. Where her return had meant the earth was not ready, her failure to return meant it was. Noah did not need another sign. The dove had spoken, or rather, had stopped speaking, and her silence was the most eloquent testimony of all. On the 1st day of the 1st month of Noah's 601st year, he removed the covering of the ark and looked out. The text says he looked, and what he saw was the surface of the ground, dried. After more than a year inside the vessel, after more than 12 months of darkness and confinement, and the smell of animals and pitch, and the sound of rain and water and creaking wood, Noah looked out and saw earth. Real earth. Mud, perhaps, still wet in places, and still scarred by the violence of what had happened to it, but solid and visible and stretching out in every direction from the base of the mountain on which the ark sat. But the ground was not yet fully dry. The surface had dried, but the deeper soil remained saturated, too wet to walk on, too soft to support the weight of the larger animals, too unstable for the kind of activity that would be needed to begin again. Noah could see the world. He could not yet enter it, and so he waited again, because waiting was what Noah did. He waited through the rest of the 1st month and all of the 2nd month, until the 27th day of the 2nd month, when the earth was finally, fully, completely dried out. From the day the flood began to the day the earth was dry, 1 year and 10 days, 370 days of water and confinement and silence and work and faith, a full year of the world being underwater, and then, at last, it was over. The ark sat on the mountain like a monument to endurance, its hull stained and battered by a year of waves and weather, its interior rank with the accumulated smell of a floating menagerie, its passengers thinner than when they had entered, older, quieter, carrying the weight of everything they had survived and everything they had lost. The sky above was clear. The ground below was solid. The world outside was empty, scrubbed clean, waiting to be filled again. Noah stood at the window and looked out at a landscape no human eyes had ever seen before, because this landscape had not existed before. The old world, the world of cities and roads and fields and forests, was buried under hundreds of feet of sediment, compressed into the geological record like a flower pressed between the pages of a book. What Noah saw was raw creation, a world of bare rock and fresh mud and thin rivulets of water still finding their way down the mountainside, a world without a single footprint, without a single structure, without a single sign that anyone had ever been here before. It was beautiful, in the way that only truly empty things can be beautiful, the beauty of a blank page, of an unmarked canvas, of a silence so deep that the first sound to break it will carry for miles. 8 people and several thousand animals. That was the sum total of terrestrial life on the planet. Every bird that would ever sing, every beast that would ever roam, every insect that would ever crawl, every human being that would ever live would descend from the passengers of this single vessel, sitting on a mountaintop in eastern Turkey, looking out at a world that was waiting to be named all over again. But Noah did not move. He did not open the door. He had entered the ark at God's command, and he would leave it the same way. The door that God had shut, only God could open. And so Noah waited, one final time, for the voice that had started everything to tell him it was safe to begin. God spoke. After the longest silence in the story, after the months of waiting and working and trusting in the dark, the voice that had commissioned the ark, that had specified its dimensions and commanded its occupants to enter, now issued its final instruction regarding the vessel. Go out of the ark, you and your wife, and your sons and your sons' wives with you. Bring out with you every living thing that is with you of all flesh, birds and animals, and every creeping thing that creeps on the earth, that they may swarm on the earth and be fruitful and multiply on the earth. Go out. 2 words that contained within them the end of an ordeal and the beginning of a world. Noah had entered the ark at God's invitation, and he had refused to leave it without God's permission, and now that permission had come. The same voice that had said, "Come in," was now saying, "Go out." And the symmetry was as deliberate as everything else in this meticulously structured story. God opened the chapter, and God closed it. The man's role was to obey both times. The door opened. Whether Noah opened it himself or whether God unsealed it as he had sealed it, the text does not specify. But the moment that door swung wide, after more than a year of enclosure, the air that rushed in would have been unlike anything the 8 passengers had breathed in over 12 months. Clean air. Wet air, still heavy with the moisture of a drying world, carrying the mineral smell of freshly exposed rock and the sharp green scent of new vegetation pushing through the mud. After a year of breathing the stale, animal-thick atmosphere of the ark's interior, that first lungful of outside air must have been intoxicating, almost painful in its freshness, a physical shock that would have made them blink and gasp and stand very still for a moment, adjusting to the sensation of breathing something that had not already been breathed by 1,000 other creatures. Noah stepped out. His wife stepped out beside him. Shem and his wife, Ham and his wife, Japheth and his wife, each of them crossing the threshold from the darkness of the ark into the light of a world they had never seen, a world that none of them recognized, because the world they had known was buried under sediment so deep that not a single familiar landmark remained. They stood on the slope of a mountain in the Ararat range, looking out at a landscape of bare rock and thin soil and sparse, struggling vegetation, with no roads, no buildings, no fences, no paths worn by human feet. The emptiness was total. They were the only people on earth, and the earth was as foreign to them as another planet. And then the animals came out. The text records their departure with the same expansive language it used for everything else in the story. Every beast, every creeping thing, and every bird, everything that moves on the earth, went out by families from the ark. By families, not in the pairs that had entered, but in families, suggesting that during the year inside the ark, some of the animals had bred, had produced offspring, had already begun the work of multiplication that God was about to command. The ark had not merely preserved life, it had incubated it. The vessel that had served as a lifeboat during the flood had also served as a nursery, and the creatures that emerged were, in some cases, already more numerous than the ones that had entered. They would have come blinking into the light, just as the humans had, their bodies adjusting to open space after months of confinement, their legs unsteady on ground that did not rock and pitch beneath them. The birds would have launched from the upper deck in a burst of wings, scattering across a sky that had no competition, claiming the empty air as their own. The larger animals would have descended more cautiously, testing the unfamiliar terrain with tentative steps, sniffing the wind for scents that carried no information, because there was nothing out there to smell except rock and water and the faint beginnings of plant life. The insects would have dispersed almost immediately, vanishing into the crevices and the soil with the efficiency of creatures that do not need to deliberate about their next move. They spread in every direction, driven by instinct and by the command God had embedded in their nature, "Be fruitful and multiply, fill the earth, repopulate the empty forests and the barren fields, and the silent rivers that had not heard the splash of a fish or the call of a frog in over a year." The world that had been reduced to a single vessel's worth of life was about to begin expanding again, slowly at first, then faster and faster as each generation produced the next, until the mountains and the valleys and the plains were teeming once more with the noise and motion and hunger that are the marks of a living planet. But Noah did not follow the animals down the mountain. He did not immediately begin scouting for farmland or building a shelter or doing any of the practical things that a reasonable man in his position might have prioritized. The first thing Noah did, the very first act of the new world, was build an altar. He built it with stones gathered from the mountainside, piling them into a rough platform on the bare rock of Ararat, and on that altar he placed offerings. He took some of every clean animal and some of every clean bird and offered burnt offerings on the altar. This is why God had instructed him to bring 7 pairs of every clean animal rather than just 2. This moment was built into the mathematics from the beginning. The extra animals were not surplus. They were not insurance against loss. They were sacrifices set apart before the flood began for the express purpose of being offered on the first altar of the new world. It was the first recorded altar in the narrative. Adam had not built one. Cain and Abel had brought offerings, but the text does not mention an altar. No altar is described in the long centuries between Eden and the flood. Noah's altar was the first, and what he placed upon it was the first formal act of worship in a world that had been washed clean of everything, including, and perhaps especially, the memory of what worship looked like. The old world had forgotten how to worship. The new world began with it. The burnt offering was total. Unlike other types of sacrifice that would be described in later centuries, where parts of the animal were given to God and parts were kept for the one who offered it, the burnt offering was consumed entirely by the fire. Nothing was held back. Nothing was reserved for the family. The whole animal, skin and flesh and bone, was placed on the altar and burned until nothing remained but ash. It was the most complete expression of surrender available, a statement that said, "Everything I have comes from you, and I give it all back." After a year of carefully rationing food, after months of calculating whether the supplies would last, after the grinding anxiety of not knowing whether there would be enough to survive, Noah took a portion of the precious living cargo he had spent a year keeping alive and gave it away. He burned it. He let the smoke rise into the clean sky above a clean world, and he offered it to the God who had destroyed everything and saved everything, and was now standing, as it were, on the other side of the catastrophe, waiting to see what the survivor would do first. What Noah did first was worship. Not build, not plant, not plan, worship. And God's response to that worship is one of the most remarkable passages in the entire account, because it reveals something about the interior life of God that the narrative has been building toward since the moment he first expressed grief over the corruption of the world. "And when the Lord smelled the pleasing aroma, the Lord said in his heart, I will never again curse the ground because of man, for the intention of man's heart is evil from his youth. Neither will I ever again strike down every living creature as I have done." Read that again, slowly. God smelled the offering, and the aroma pleased him, and in response he made a declaration that is stunning in its implications. He would never again curse the ground because of humanity. He would never again destroy every living creature. And the reason he gave for this promise was not that humanity had changed. It was not that the flood had fixed the problem. It was not that Noah's descendants would be better than their predecessors. The reason God gave was this: For the intention of man's heart is evil from his youth. The same diagnosis that had prompted the flood was now offered as the reason it would never happen again. Humanity's heart was evil before the flood, and it would be evil after the flood, and God was choosing, in full knowledge of that unchanging reality, to respond to it differently this time. The old world had been destroyed because the human heart was corrupt. The new world would be preserved despite the human heart being corrupt. The difference was not in humanity. The difference was in God. Something had shifted, not in his knowledge, for he had always known what the human heart contained, but in his posture toward it. The flood had been the response of justice. The promise that followed was the response of mercy. And the two did not contradict each other, because the same God who was just enough to drown a world was merciful enough to vow never to do it again. Then God made a promise about the earth itself, a promise that reaches beyond the story of Noah and extends to every generation that would follow. While the earth remains, seed time and harvest, cold and heat, summer and winter, day and night shall not cease. It is the foundation upon which all of human civilization rests, though most of humanity does not know it. Every farmer who plants a crop is relying on this promise. Every sailor who reads the seasons is depending on it. Every person who wakes up in the morning and assumes the sun will rise is living inside the guarantee that God made on a mountainside in Ararat, standing beside a stone altar that smelled of burnt offerings, speaking to a man who had just survived the end of the world. The regularity of nature, the predictable cycling of seasons and tides and temperatures that makes agriculture and navigation and daily life possible is not a feature of physics. It is a feature of a promise. The earth endures because God said it would endure, and God said it would endure because a man named Noah built an altar and worshipped. God blessed Noah and his sons, and the words of the blessing were an echo of the original blessing given to Adam and Eve in the garden. Be fruitful and multiply and fill the earth. The same commission, the same language, the same mandate to populate the world and exercise dominion over it. The new world was beginning the way the old world had begun, with a divine command to grow and fill and govern, as if God were pressing the reset button on the human story and starting the narrative over from its opening line. But the new world would not be identical to the old one. The conditions had changed, and God was explicit about how. The fear of you and the dread of you shall be upon every beast of the earth, and upon every bird of the heavens, upon everything that creeps on the ground, and all the fish of the sea. Into your hand they are delivered. In the original creation, humanity had been given dominion over the animals, but the relationship had apparently been one of stewardship, not predation. Now, after the flood, the animals would fear human beings. The harmony that had existed in Eden, the peaceable coexistence of man and beast that the creation account implied, was formally ended. The animals would dread the creatures God had placed in authority over them, and that dread was a new feature of the post-flood world, a concession to the reality that the relationship between humanity and the rest of creation had been irreparably altered. And then came the permission that changed the human diet forever. Every moving thing that lives shall be food for you. And as I gave you the green plants, I give you everything. Before the flood, according to the text, the human diet had been exclusively vegetarian. God had given Adam and Eve every seed-bearing plant and every tree with fruit in it for food, and there is no indication that this permission was ever expanded to include meat. Now, after the flood, it was. Animals could be killed and eaten. The entire animal kingdom was placed on the human table, a sweeping expansion of dietary freedom that recognized the new reality of a world in which the old harmonies no longer held. But the permission came with a restriction, and the restriction was absolute. But you shall not eat flesh with its life, that is, its blood. The blood was off limits. The blood represented the life of the creature. the animating force that God had breathed into every living thing, and it was not to be consumed. A man could kill an animal and eat its meat, but he could not drink its blood, or eat flesh from which the blood had not been drained. The distinction was theological, not dietary. It was a reminder that even in a world where animals could be killed for food, life itself remained sacred, a gift from God that could be taken under certain conditions but never treated casually, never consumed as if it were merely another commodity. And from the sanctity of animal life, God moved to the sanctity of human life, and the language he used carried a weight that would echo through every legal code, every system of justice, every moral framework that human civilization would ever produce. Whoever sheds the blood of man, by man shall his blood be shed. For God made man in his own image. It was the first law of the new world, the foundation stone of human justice, and it was rooted not in social contract or political theory, but in the nature of humanity itself. Human life was sacred, because human beings were made in the image of God. To kill a human being was to destroy something that bore the likeness of the Creator, and the penalty for that destruction was death, carried out not by God directly, but by other human beings, acting as agents of divine justice. The old world had been destroyed by violence. The new world would not be free of violence, because human hearts had not changed, but it would have a mechanism for responding to it. Where the pre-flood world had no recorded system of justice, no institution empowered to punish the murderer or protect the innocent, the post-flood world was given one. The authority to execute judgment for murder was placed in human hands, a delegated power that carried with it enormous responsibility and enormous potential for abuse. But that was nonetheless necessary for a species whose hearts remained inclined toward evil from their youth. With the new laws established and the new permissions granted, God made his covenant formal. Behold, I establish my covenant with you and your offspring after you, and with every living creature that is with you, the birds, the livestock, and every beast of the earth with you, as many as came out of the ark. It is for every beast of the earth. I establish my covenant with you, that never again shall all flesh be cut off by the waters of a flood, and never again shall there be a flood to destroy the earth. The scope of this covenant is breathtaking in its inclusiveness. It was not made with Noah alone. It was not made with his descendants alone. It was made with every living creature on the earth, from the largest beast to the smallest insect, from the birds in the sky to the fish in the sea. Every animal that had ridden in the ark, every species that had been preserved through the catastrophe, was included in the covenant. They were not parties to the agreement in any conscious sense. They had not negotiated terms or pledged obedience, but they were covered by it, wrapped in its protection, shielded by its guarantee. The God who had drowned the world was now promising every living thing on the planet that he would never do it again. And then God gave the covenant a sign, and the sign was a bow. I have set my bow in the cloud, and it shall be a sign of the covenant between me and the earth. When I bring clouds over the earth and the bow is seen in the clouds, I will remember my covenant that is between me and you and every living creature of all flesh. And the waters shall never again become a flood to destroy all flesh. The Hebrew word for rainbow is kesheth, and it is the same word used for a weapon, a war bow. The image is arresting. God was not placing a decoration in the sky. He was hanging up his weapon. The bow that had been drawn against the earth, the instrument of divine judgment that had unleashed the waters of destruction, was being set aside, placed in the clouds as a permanent reminder that the war was over, that the weapon had been retired, that the God who had used it once was putting it away and promising never to use it again. It was a warrior's gesture, the act of a king who has won a devastating victory and is now signaling to the survivors that the fighting is finished. Every rainbow that has ever appeared in the sky from that day to this one is a repetition of that signal. Every arc of color that stretches across the clouds after a storm is God keeping his promise, reminding himself, as the text says he does, of the covenant he made with a man on a mountain in a world that was still drying from the worst catastrophe in its history. The rainbow is not for humanity, strictly speaking. The text says it is for God. When the bow is in the clouds, I will see it and remember the everlasting covenant between God and every living creature of all flesh that is on the earth. God sees the rainbow and remembers. The sign is aimed at its maker, not its beneficiaries. It is God's note to himself, written in light and water across the entire sky, visible from space, impossible to miss, a promise so large that it takes the whole atmosphere to display it. Noah stood on the mountain, his altar still smoldering, the last traces of smoke rising into the air above Ararat, and he looked at the bow in the cloud. He had entered the ark as a man with a commission. He was leaving it as a man with a covenant, the first man in history to receive a formal, binding, eternal promise from God, a promise not just for him, but for every creature that would ever draw breath on the face of the earth. The construction was behind him. The flood was behind him. The silence was behind him. Ahead of him lay a world without cities, without roads, without neighbors, without the 1,000 accumulated comforts and cruelties of the civilization that had drowned. It was a world that would have to be built from nothing, populated from 8, governed by laws that had never been tested, sustained by a promise that had never been broken because it had never before been made. Noah was 601 years old. He had centuries left to live. And the world he was about to inhabit, the empty and terrifying and beautiful world that stretched out below the mountains in every direction, was waiting for him to descend from the altar and begin the work of turning survival into something that looked like life. But the man who had been righteous in the old world, the man who had walked with God through a century of construction and a year of catastrophe, the man who had kept his faith through the longest silence and his gentleness through the hardest labor. That man was about to discover that surviving the flood was not the end of his story. It was not even the hardest part, because the thing that would nearly break Noah, the thing that would stain his legacy and fracture his family and cast a shadow across the rest of his days, was not a storm or a wave or a year of darkness. It was a vineyard. Noah descended from the mountain and became a man of the soil. The text announces this transition with a flatness that borders on the brutal, as if the greatest survivor in human history simply put down his altar stones, walked down the slope of Ararat, and picked up a hoe. No fanfare, no ceremony, no pause to mark the moment when the man who had carried the future of every living species on his shoulders for a year became, once again, a farmer. He had been born into a world that worked the ground under a curse, and now, standing in the thin soil of a freshly scoured earth, he returned to the same labor. The world had changed. The man's occupation had not. He planted a vineyard. Of all the crops he might have chosen, of all the seeds he might have pressed into the new earth, Noah planted grapes. The choice is significant, though the text does not explain it. Grapes require patience. A newly planted vine does not produce fruit for 3 to 5 years, sometimes longer, and a vineyard that produces wine-quality grapes demands careful tending, pruning, watering, and an intimate knowledge of the soil and the seasons. Noah was not planting for tomorrow. He was planting for the years ahead, committing himself to a piece of land and a process that would bind him to it for the foreseeable future. After a century of building and a year of floating, the man who had lived the most extraordinary life in human history was settling down. The vineyard grew, the vines produced, and Noah made wine. What happened next is recorded in 3 verses, and those 3 verses contain the most uncomfortable episode in Noah's entire story. an episode that the narrative refuses to sanitize or explain away, that it simply lays before the reader with the same unflinching directness it brings to everything else. He drank of the wine and became drunk, and lay uncovered in his tent. Noah got drunk. The man described as righteous, the man described as blameless, the man who walked with God, drank too much wine and passed out naked in his tent. The text does not soften this. It does not say he was overwhelmed by grief. It does not say the wine was stronger than he expected. It does not offer the excuse that perhaps in a pre-flood world where some traditions hold that fermentation worked differently, Noah did not understand what the wine would do to him. It simply tells you what happened. He drank. He got drunk. He lay exposed. The hero of the flood was face down in his tent, bare and insensible, stripped of every shred of the dignity that had defined him for 6 centuries. Was this the first time Noah had ever tasted wine? Some have suggested it was, that the fermentation process was unfamiliar to him, that he could not have anticipated its effects. Others argue that a man who had lived for over 600 years, who had successfully managed the most complex logistical operation in human history, was not likely to be surprised by the basic chemistry of grape juice left to sit. The truth is that the text does not care why he got drunk. It cares what happened because he got drunk. The cause is irrelevant. The consequence is everything, and the consequence involved his son Ham. And Ham, the father of Canaan, saw the nakedness of his father and told his 2 brothers outside. The text specifies that Ham was the father of Canaan before it tells us what he did. The detail seems misplaced, an interruption in the narrative flow, a genealogical note shoved into the middle of a story about shame. But the detail is there for a reason, and the reason will become apparent in a moment when the curse falls not on Ham, but on the son whose name the text has just made sure you noticed. What exactly did Ham do? The surface reading is straightforward. He walked into his father's tent, saw Noah lying naked and drunk, and instead of covering him, went outside and told his brothers. He reported his father's shame to Shem and Japheth, broadcasting the old man's vulnerability to the only audience available, turning a private humiliation into a shared spectacle. At minimum, it was an act of disrespect so fundamental that it violated every code of filial honor the ancient world held sacred. A son who saw his father exposed had one duty: to cover him quietly, immediately, and without comment. Ham did the opposite. He looked, he left, and he talked. But many who have studied this passage over the centuries believe that something darker happened inside that tent, something the text gestures toward without fully describing. The phrase, "saw the nakedness of his father," may carry a meaning that goes beyond mere observation. In later legal codes, uncovering the nakedness of a family member is a euphemism for sexual violation, and some interpreters have argued that Ham did not merely look at his father, but committed an act against him, an act so transgressive that the narrative could only describe it in veiled language. Others have suggested that Ham's offense was an act of dominance, a symbolic assertion of power over a weakened patriarch, an attempt to seize authority by humiliating the man who held it. Still others take the text at face value. Ham saw, Ham told, and the seeing and the telling were crime enough. The text does not resolve the debate. It leaves the space between the lines deliberately ambiguous, trusting the reader to understand that whatever happened in that tent was severe enough to warrant the response that followed. The mystery is part of the story. The gap is the story. Shem and Japheth heard what their brother told them, and their response was the precise opposite of his. They took a garment, laid it across both their shoulders, and walked backward into the tent, walking backward, facing away, their eyes averted, Their bodies turned from the sight they refused to see. They approached their father's prone form and laid the garment over him, covering his nakedness without ever looking at it. The text specifies every detail of their posture and their movement, because the details are the point. Every step they took was a deliberate rejection of what Ham had done. Where Ham had looked, they refused to look. Where Ham had exposed, they covered. Where Ham had treated his father's shame as entertainment, they treated it as something sacred, something that demanded protection rather than exploitation. It is a portrait of honor, drawn entirely in physical gestures. The garment on their shoulders, the backward walk, the averted faces, the careful placement of the cloth. No words are recorded. No speeches, no declarations of loyalty or condemnation of their brother. Just the silent, dignified act of two sons covering a father who could not cover himself. Noah woke from his wine and knew what his youngest son had done to him. The text says he knew, which implies that someone told him or that the evidence of what had happened was apparent. Whatever the source of his knowledge, Noah's response was immediate, and it was devastating. He did not curse Ham, he cursed Canaan. Cursed be Canaan. A servant of servants shall he be to his brothers. The words fell on the son, not the father, the grandson, not the one who had committed the act. And the question of why Canaan bore the punishment for Ham's transgression has tormented readers and commentators for thousands of years. Some have argued that Canaan was cursed because he was somehow involved in the incident, that he was present in the tent, that he participated in whatever Ham did, that the text omits his involvement but implies it by naming him. Others have suggested that Ham was punished through his son because the loss of a child's future is a more devastating blow than any direct curse could inflict, that to watch your own son and his descendants bear the weight of your sin is a penalty that cuts deeper than any wound to the self. Still others point to the prophetic nature of the curse, arguing that Noah, speaking under divine influence, was not so much punishing Canaan for the past as predicting the fate of the Canaanite people in the future, a people who would indeed be conquered and subjugated by the descendants of Shem and Japheth in the centuries to come. The text, true to its nature, does not settle the argument. It records the curse and moves on, leaving the reader to wrestle with a justice that looks, from every available angle, like something more complicated than justice. Then Noah turned to his other sons and blessed them. Blessed be the Lord, the God of Shem, and let Canaan be his servant. The blessing of Shem was not a blessing on Shem himself, but on Shem's God. Noah did not say, Blessed be Shem. He said, Blessed be the Lord, the God of Shem, which is another way of saying that the highest honor a man can receive is not personal greatness, but proximity to the divine, that to be the one through whom God works is a blessing that surpasses any other. Shem's line would carry the knowledge of God forward through history, and the promise embedded in that blessing would extend through generations until it produced a man named Abraham, and through Abraham, a nation, and through that nation, a faith that would shape the trajectory of human civilization. May God enlarge Japheth, and let him dwell in the tents of Shem, and let Canaan be his servant. Japheth's blessing was expansion, geographical and numerical. His descendants would spread across the earth in numbers and territory that would dwarf those of his brothers, covering the coastlands and the northern territories, and eventually the continents that lay beyond the horizon of the ancient world. But Japheth's blessing was linked to Shem's. He would dwell in the tents of Shem, which some have read as a prophecy that Japheth's descendants would eventually come to share in the spiritual inheritance of Shem's line, that the God of Shem would one day become the God of the peoples that Japheth fathered. The curse and the blessings drew a map of the future across the lives of three brothers, a map that the rest of history would spend centuries filling in. From one tent on a hillside near a vineyard in the post-flood world, 3 destinies were set in motion, 3 lines of descent that would populate every continent, build every civilization, fight every war, and produce every human being who would ever live. Noah lived 350 years after the flood. 3.5 centuries of life in the new world, watching his sons and their wives produce children, watching those children produce children of their own, watching the empty earth slowly fill with people and animals and the first tentative signs of returning civilization. He would have seen the first new cities rise from the mud, the first roads cut through the wilderness, and the first fields planted and harvested in soil that the flood had scoured and then fertilized with the sediment of the old world. He would have watched his grandchildren grow up and his great-grandchildren be born, an expanding family tree that branched outward from the slopes of Ararat in every direction. What kind of man was he during those centuries? The text does not say. After the vineyard incident, Noah disappears from the narrative almost entirely. He is mentioned, his lifespan is recorded, and his death is noted, but no further actions, no further words, and no further encounters with God are described. The silence is as striking as the silence inside the ark, and it is just as open to interpretation. Perhaps Noah lived out his remaining years quietly, tending his vineyard, counseling his descendants, watching the new world with the cautious eyes of a man who remembered what had happened to the old one. Perhaps the shame of the vineyard and the fracture with Ham left him diminished, a man who had endured the end of the world but could not endure the sight of his own failure. Perhaps he simply faded, the way all extraordinary men eventually fade, from the center of the story to its margins, from protagonist to ancestor, from the one man God remembered to a name in a genealogy. He died at the age of 950, and the text records it with the same terse formula it uses for every death in the long lineage that preceded him. And he died. 2 words. The same 2 words that had punctuated the genealogy from Adam to Lamech. The same 2 words that had tolled like a bell through 10 generations of patriarchs, now falling on Noah himself. He who had survived the flood, who had walked with God, who had built the ark and kept the faith and carried the future on his shoulders for a year and then set it down on a mountain and watched it grow. Even he was not exempt, and he died. The curse pronounced in Eden, the promise that dust would return to dust, held true for the man who had outlived every other human being on the planet. Noah, the man whose name meant rest, finally found it. But the world he left behind was growing faster than any single man could track. The Table of Nations, as it has come to be known, records the descendants of Noah's 3 sons with a scope and a specificity that reads less like a family tree and more like a map of the entire ancient world. Every people, every nation, every language group that the world of the ancient Near East was aware of is traced back to one of 3 men standing on a mountain in eastern Turkey, blinking in the sunlight of a freshly washed earth. From Japheth came the peoples of the north and the west. His son Gomer fathered tribes that would settle in what is now Turkey and the regions around the Black Sea. Magog's descendants would spread into the vast steppes of Central Asia, becoming the nomadic peoples whose movements would shape the geopolitics of the ancient world for millennia. Madai fathered the Medes, the great empire that would one day rule Persia. Javan fathered the Ionians, the Greeks, the people who would give the world philosophy and democracy and the Olympic Games. From Japheth's line came the coastland peoples, the maritime civilizations, the explorers and settlers who would eventually reach every continent on earth. His blessing of enlargement was not metaphorical. It was a demographic prophecy that the centuries would fulfill with almost mathematical precision. From Ham came the peoples of the south and the east. His son Cush fathered the Ethiopians and the peoples of the Upper Nile. Mizraim was Egypt, the civilization of the pyramids and the pharaohs, the land that would one day enslave Shem's descendants and then be broken by their God. Put fathered the Libyans, the peoples of North Africa's western coast. And Canaan, the son who bore the curse, fathered the Canaanites, the Sidonians, the Hittites, the Jebusites, the Amorites, and a dozen other peoples who would inhabit the land that God would one day promise to Abraham and his descendants, a promise that would be fulfilled at the direct expense of Canaan's line, exactly as Noah had prophesied in his tent. But from Ham's line also came one of the most striking figures in the entire Table of Nations, a man whose shadow extends far beyond his single paragraph in the genealogy. Nimrod, the son of Cush, the grandson of Ham. The text describes him as the first on earth to be a mighty man and a mighty hunter before the Lord, and his kingdom included Babel, Erech, Akkad, and Calneh in the land of Shinar. From there he went into Assyria, where he built Nineveh, the great city. Nimrod was the first empire builder, the first man after the flood to accumulate power on a scale that dwarfed his neighbors, the first to build cities and rule over them, the first to impose his will on the earth by force and cunning and the sheer magnetism of a personality that the text calls mighty. He was the founder of Babylon, the city that would become, in the narrative that followed, the symbol of everything that was wrong with human ambition, the place where men would build a tower to reach the heavens and be scattered for their arrogance. Nimrod was Ham's legacy, and it was a legacy of power without restraint, greatness without humility, the same pattern that had defined the mighty men of renown in the world before the flood. From Shem came the peoples through whom the story would continue to be told. Shem's descendants are listed with a care and a precision that reflects their importance in the larger narrative. His son Arpachshad fathered Shelah, who fathered Eber, from whose name the word Hebrew is derived. Eber fathered Peleg, in whose days the earth was divided, a cryptic phrase that some have connected to the scattering at Babel and others to a physical division of the continents. From this line, generation after generation, the genealogy would continue forward until it reached a man named Terah, who lived in Ur of the Chaldeans, and Terah fathered a son named Abram, who would one day be called Abraham. And with Abraham, the story that began in Eden and passed through the flood would enter a new chapter entirely. The Table of Nations ends with a summary that is both simple and staggering. These are the clans of the sons of Noah, according to their genealogies in their nations, and from these the nations spread abroad on the earth after the flood. Every nation, every people, every language, every war and every peace, every empire and every village, every migration and every settlement, all of it traced back to one family, standing on a mountain, looking out at a world with no footprints in it. The story of Noah echoes far beyond the borders of the text that contains it. Long before the Hebrew account was compiled into the form we know, long before the scrolls were copied and recopied by scribes in Jerusalem and Babylon and Alexandria, other civilizations were telling their own versions of the same story. The Mesopotamians had Utnapishtim, the hero of the Gilgamesh epic, who was warned by the god Ea that a flood was coming and instructed to build a vessel to save his family and the animals. The Sumerian tradition preserved the name Ziusudra, a righteous king who survived a deluge sent by the gods and was granted immortality on the other side. The Akkadians told of Atrahasis, a wise man who built a boat on divine instruction and floated through a catastrophe that destroyed the rest of humanity. The details vary. The vessel is sometimes round, sometimes square, sometimes a cube. The duration differs. The number of passengers changes. The gods argue among themselves about whether the flood was a good idea. But the bones of the story are the same. A wicked world, a divine decision to destroy it, A single righteous man warned in advance. A vessel, a flood, a survival, a new beginning. The parallels extend further than Mesopotamia. The Greeks told of Deucalion and Pyrrha, survivors of a flood sent by Zeus, who repopulated the earth by throwing stones over their shoulders. The Hindu tradition preserved the story of Manu, warned by a fish to build a boat before a great deluge. Flood stories appear in the oral traditions of indigenous peoples across every inhabited continent, from the Americas to Australia to East Asia, cultures separated by oceans and millennia, with no apparent connection to each other, all telling some version of the same account. The world was once drowned, and someone survived. What does this convergence mean? For some, it is evidence that the flood was a historical event, a global catastrophe preserved in the collective memory of every civilization that descended from its survivors. For others, it is evidence that flood myths are a universal response to the human experience of living near rivers and coastlines, where catastrophic flooding is a recurring reality, and the story of a great flood is simply the narrative shape that fear takes when water is the dominant threat. The text does not arbitrate between these positions. It tells its version and lets the reader decide what to do with the others. But whatever one makes of the parallels, the story of Noah occupies a unique position in the narrative arc of the text that contains it. It is the hinge. It is the pivot point between the primeval world and the historical world, between the age of creation and fall and curse and corruption and the age of covenant and law and promise and nation. Everything before Noah is prologue. Everything after Noah is a consequence. He stands at the center of the story, the way the flood stands at the center of geological history in the traditions that affirm it. A dividing line, a before and after, a moment when the clock was reset and the calendar started over, and the world began again with the smell of burnt offerings and the arc of a bow in the clouds. Noah was not a perfect man. The Vineyard proved that. He was not a prophet in the formal sense, though he preached for a century. He was not a king, though the future of every kingdom flowed through him. He was not a priest, though he built the first altar and offered the first sacrifice of the new world. He was, in the end, what the text said he was at the beginning: a righteous man, blameless in his generation, who walked with God. Not a man without faults, not a man without weakness, not a man who emerged from the ordeal unscathed. A man who did what God asked, even when what God asked was impossible, even when the asking lasted 100 years, even when the obedience cost him everything he knew and everyone he had ever met, and who kept doing it, day after day, plank by plank, season by season, until the task was done. He was born into a world that was dying. He built the vessel that carried life through its death. He stepped onto the empty earth on the other side and planted a vineyard, and got drunk and cursed his grandson and blessed his other sons, and lived for 350 more years, and then, like every man before him and every man after him, he died. His bones are somewhere in the earth he helped to save. His name is in every language on the planet. His story is told in synagogues and churches and mosques and classrooms and living rooms and around campfires on every continent that his descendants settled. And it is always, at its core, the same story. The world went wrong, and God started over. And he started over through a man who did nothing more remarkable than believe what he was told and do what he was asked. 950 years. A man who saw the old world and the new. A man who heard God speak and watched God act and stood in the gap between justice and mercy and somehow, imperfectly, impossibly held on. The rain has stopped. The bow is in the cloud. And somewhere on a hillside in the ancient East, a vine planted by the oldest man in the world is bearing fruit in soil that the whole ocean once covered reaching its roots down into the dark earth and its branches up toward a sky that promised, once and for all, never to fall again.